Welcome to GONKCAST, a long-form discussion podcast about the music of English electronic duo Autechre, album by album, EP by EP. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
And this is another episode in our AE Revisited series, this time on Autechre's 2013 masterpiece, Exai. Before we jump in, don't forget that we've launched a Patreon where for just $5 a month, you'll get bi-weekly bonus episodes on AE adjacent music, plus the opportunity to vote on future bonus episode topics. Last week, for example, the patrons chose Pansonic's 1997 classic, Colma. That was a fun episode, wasn't it, Dan?
Yeah, that was a real good one.
I was particularly happy with that one. I thought that's a very one
same.
of those very interesting records. The patrons have been picking good ones. So head over to patreon.com/GONKCAST and join us for those. Shout out, by the way, to our newest patron, Outro Intro. For our next bonus episode coming next week, the patrons have chosen Cupid's Head by The Field, 2013 record from The Field. So we'll have a little 2013 synergy going on there after our discussion of Exai this week. Look out for that. Send us your thoughts on Cupid's Head by The Field, gonkcastpod@gmail.com. And then for our next main episode, free for everybody as always, we're going to revisit Autechre's Elevent EP. We thought it would be fun to, kind of wrap up the Exai conversation by doing a proper episode on that. And I don't know about you, Dan, but I just had so much fun, differentiating this a little bit from our first run of this podcast by, where we would kind of tack the EPs on to the main episode discussions. But doing a whole episode on an EP, I think, can be really rewarding, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm looking forward to just digging straight into that. Because like you said, we always tacked them on. So it was, listening to Exai for 2 hours and having to, squeeze Elevent in. So I look forward to it.
Yeah, I think it'll be really fun. So revisit that for yourself. Tell us what you think about Elevent. Again, that's gonkcastpod@gmail.com. So we like to start off with news when there is some, and any corrections, leftovers. There actually is some relatively big news this week. Autechre played their first shows of 2026 last week on February the 4th and the 5th. In Tokyo and Osaka, Japan, respectively. Listener Darren actually attended the Tokyo show and wrote in with this inside scoop. Quote, "The Tokyo show was similar in structure to the recent Set E shows for the most part. Apart from those synth melodies in the last 5 to 10 minutes, Darren included a clip of this for us, which I feel like they were pushing forward into something new. Sound-wise, lots of low end, but not sure if that was intentional or not because of the venue/sound system. Huge crowd. The venue was sold out, so nearly 2,500 people according to the website's capacity. But I wonder if they sold that many tickets or maybe lowered the capacity because of the darkness, for safety reasons. Anyway, it was packed and the crowd really responded to the set. Kohei Matsunaga supported. His set started in his usual wonky techno style, but went really hard as it progressed. Mills level techno, good stuff. For the record, AE Pages currently has the Tokyo set identified as another Set E, as Darren said, but actually has it sort of stopping a little earlier than some of the previous Set Es. Not that they couldn't have still been sort of, revamping some of the ending there, which, tends to be where they are kind of revamping things. But of course, that could be preliminary. Anyway, Osaka hasn't been identified yet, last time I checked, but I'm guessing it's probably another Set E, so we are not in Set F just yet. I'm hoping for that, fall European tour. Now, on top of all this stuff, the Japan Times published a review of the Tokyo show as well, which I'll link in the show notes. And bigger news, I guess, Sean and Rob did an interview with Japanese site lking.net. I think they've done a couple of these in the past, but I'll link that in the show notes as well. What do you think, Dan, of the show? The interview was particularly interesting, I thought.
Yeah, the interview was really cool. They talked about a lot of stuff we've wondered about, AI, and they do a lot of talking about Confield and Choristus, I think. Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting. I liked how Google translates Autechre to Autechre or something. It's something real fun. that was amusing.
Yeah. There was some interesting stuff that I kind of highlighted. Maybe it would be too much to read it all, but yeah, they talked a little bit about, kind of modern hyperpop music. They got a shout out from Charlie XCX at the Brit Awards, who thanked them in her speech. So, they talked a little bit about that and kind of had this interesting, Sean had this interesting comment about, he says, I hope this doesn't sound weird, but I feel like the music scene as a whole has been slowly drawing closer to us recently, and thus like he's found more things to enjoy than he would normally expect kind of in the pop world. There was interesting conversation about Chorustis, which Sean explicitly identified as the starting point that led to where we are today. He also had this comment, in a way, Chorustis is a return to what we were doing from the early 90s until about 1996 when everything was live and recorded in one take. I think you could say that Untilted was the final chapter of a long chapter of increasingly structured compositions that began around 96, 97. Chorustis reflected that shift back to freedom, and that's relevant to us now. I think it was listener Joe who wrote in, I forgot to copy it in here, but basically saying, after this, it feels like we got to talk Chorustis pretty soon on this revisited series. I think so. I think after we do Elevent, we should probably do Chorustis, since they have now explicitly said we view this as the beginning of the 2022 Dash project.
Yeah, I was kind of wanting to do that anyways, especially since like Versions has been put up on streaming and stuff too. So I think that's totally a good way to go.
Another thing that was really interesting that they brought up, as you mentioned, was about AI, right? Sean had this interesting quote. For me, the biggest problem with AI is that it's trained on existing works. So it's referential, not exploratory. It doesn't go beyond that. To be honest, I don't find it that exciting. That said, don't get me wrong, there are legitimate creative avenues for using machine learning and similar technologies that are completely different from what tech guys are doing today. I think some of those uses will be fruitful in the future. In fact, we ourselves have been using machine learning on and off for the last 15 years, though in different contexts. Really, really interesting. I don't know. I almost couldn't have put it better myself, right? Which is like, if you're interested in, I don't know, like exploring things, then just having it generate stuff for you is pretty much antithetical to that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I liked that a lot when I read it, because he's right. When it's only referential, you never expand from that.
Yeah, because and I think he kind of puts it nicely, which is like, we've been thinking on the podcast about, well, isn't there something similar to generative AI with what they do with like Max? But I think I don't know. It's like, I like how he put that. There was another really interesting comment about their interest in kind of like the rawness of improvisation, which I actually want to save for later because I think it might be relevant to our conversation. And then, some interesting stuff about Confield, which in sort of retrospect, they see as a turning point for them. Kind of a funny comment about what would be a record that you would recommend to a new fan or something, and they decided Confield would be a good one. So we'll have to add that to the list as well. Something that we'll have to do on this revisited series. I also wanted to read this sort of leftover message from listener Tyler about our Envain episode. He said, the last two tracks in Envain are the closest I think that Autechre has ever come to sounding like Boards of Canada. I often wonder to what degree these big names in IDM influence each other and listen to each other's work. So I always find it interesting when the artists do happen to sound like one another. In fact, this era, 1994 to 1998-ish, is when the big three, Boards of Canada, Aphex Twin, and Autechre, came the closest to converging in sound. The set of Envain, Twoism, I Care Because You Do all go together extremely well. From there, the groups would diverge from one another in sound in a way that makes it difficult to see how they all even came from the same music scene in the 90s. It is an interesting point, right? That there does seem to be that point of convergence, right? Where you kind of agree that they were all, some of these like big names were kind of on the same page there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's natural. They were at least Aphex and Autechre are like working in the same, sorts of scenes, and then at some point you go your own, different ways and stuff. But it is totally interesting, especially like, Boards of Canada. I don't think they were, they're from a different spot, aren't they?
Yeah. I would assume so. Yeah. Not probably crossing paths. I don't know. Yeah. We should look that up. Like, what is I guess one of these days we'll do a bonus episode probably on Boards of Canada, and we'll do a little research on if they've ever talked about each other or what. Cause I honestly have never even looked into that.
Yeah, me neither.
All right. Well, should we dive into Exai, which I'm extra eager to dive into because it is so long and we have so much to talk about?
Yeah, let's do it. All right, a little bit of background. Exai is Autechre's 11th LP, hence the title. It was originally released on February 7th, 2013. We knew I had to get this one on our Revisited series because so many view it as the start of AE's current era. Indeed, a lot of Exai grew out of improvised jams with the live rig for the Oversteps tour, which is obviously similar to the way they're composing now on the 2022 Dash project. It's also similar to Choristus, which grew out of jams with the live rig for the Untilted tour, but Choristus was done mostly with hardware, whereas Exai was mostly max MSP, just like 2022 Dash. However, Exai is unique for featuring samples of, quote, a lot of found sounds and field recordings like bits of city life, wood, rubber, and direct recordings of rain on certain objects.
Exai is also indicative of AE's future trajectory because it marked the point that the guys really started to experiment with maximalist releases. It's 2 hours long, which, seems kind of quaint now, but was a big deal at the time. Almost every review from the time complains about it, believe it or not. As well as with format, they apparently conceived of Exai as a box of 4 12 inches. And in fact, the Elevent EP, which came out several months later, is supposed to be another 12-inch that is interchangeable with any of those 4. We'll definitely talk about that. But Dan, how did you feel about Exai prior to our revisit this week?
Exai has been one of my favorites for a long time. I think it's maybe the record that took me from being a fan of Autechre to being a real big fan and really digging into it and everything. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, this is one of my favorites. I was always Autechre was always one of my favorite electronic artists. Mm-hmm. But when this came out, they became one of my favorite artists, period.
Yeah.
This just took it to another level for me. And a lot of listeners wrote in. I didn't even use very many of them because a lot of people had the same story where Exai was either the thing that kind of brought them back to Autechre after, they had kind of stopped following in, some of the 2000s work, or just took their fandom to another level. I think this is where that current Autechre, obsessive community kind of is born in Exai, which is really interesting. When people start to think of them as a jam band or something, that their every movement and every note they created needed to be followed and dissected. I think that starts with Exai. I still love it. It's one of those records that when I'm listening to it, when I was listening to it this week, I was feeling this is the best record ever. I think that the only thing that could challenge that is I have that feeling every time I listen to NTS sessions as well. But for me, it could be either one of those two. It would be the best Autechre record and thus one of the best records, period.
Yeah, totally. I feel the same way. And, like I talked about in the Pansonic episode a little bit with Colma, you don't always have 4 hours to listen to NTS
right.
Or whatever. Not that 2 hours is all that much better, but in the scheme of later day Autechre, like you said, 2 hours is quaint at this point. It just it became it took me to that obsessive thing just because one it was so dense and so much stuff going on we'll talk about, but then also doing that 2 hour just huge maximal thing was just been immensely interesting to me since they've gone on that trajectory.
Yeah, I was because when you listen to this, it has such a almost White Album-esque just massive dump of material that the fact that I loved every second of it convinced me that, okay, I need to go back and listen to every single thing these guys have ever done, and I need to follow every single thing they do from here on out. But you're right. It's right on the cusp where it is still manageable. You can listen to it in a single setting. That is totally doable. But you can also cut it up in a couple of interesting ways, which we'll talk about. But, to sort of get some of the big picture stuff out front, although I want to keep it maybe a little shorter than usual because we have so many tracks, interesting tracks to talk about. But, I think that I almost changed the way I think about this record a little bit, revisiting it this week, because I always sort of thought of it as Oversteps lushness, but all scuzzed up, in a wonderfully chiastic slide type way. It has those moments, lots of moments where I was writing down in my notes, like, oh, there are like these splashes of synth, like these really lush things that, are really how I think of Oversteps being like gooey sweet like that. But when Oversteps is one of my least favorite Autechre records because I think it's almost too much. It's like too lush, it's too pretty, it's too sweet. And the fact that this is like a scuzzed up version, it's like it just hits exactly like what I want. However, I started to realize that actually no, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think it's actually the reverse, because we kind of think of Autechre as like these master technicians, at least I do, like these wizards that every sound they create, they like endlessly tinker with it until it is exactly what was in their head, But I don't think that's true anymore, especially not now listening to 2022 Dash. I think there are more like genuine experimenters and like explorers where they like to build a system and then kind of document them figuring it out. And I think Exai is like, it's rough on purpose. It is rough, like in the sense of they are building a new system. They're trying to figure it out and they don't quite have total control over it. And that's what is kind of fun and exciting about it, both for them and for us. So instead of it like being something pretty that they then scuzzed up, I think it's actually them, starting with white noise, which is basically how you start any kind of like noise production in Max, as one of our listeners once explained to us. And they're kind of, crafting it into the shape of music, but it's like, you know what I'm saying? It's like still in a rough early form. And I think that's what makes this such a cool record.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's like this era we're in now, if this is Autechre Mach 2 or whatever, like that starts now, or chorus says, fuzziness. But I think, there's no argument that you're in it by Exai. And I think like, that's what they've turned into. We've left like that meticulous programming of a track, and now we're it's more about like this system and experimenting like with that and the sounds within it. But like, yeah, the system is sort of become like, the beast that they're taming each time.
Yeah, and they're not in total control of it on Exai.
Yeah,
and
totally.
I think actually we enter this new period where they like never being in control of it. And if they feel in control of it, I think they try to push it into some area where they actually are uncomfortable. So, I always, when you listen to like Autechre, sometimes you hear like these kind of crazy sound artifacts like flying around your head and stuff, like just weird wispy noises. And you think, wow, did they sit there and go like, I want every single one of these, like I want that right here, I want this right here. I kind of don't think so. I think that a lot of times it is like a weird byproduct that maybe they don't even totally understand, and they are like as delighted as we are to hear what this thing they built is doing. Like I don't know a ton about coding or programming or anything, right? I honestly don't know anything about it, but I listen to a lot of I'm interested in like the video game industry, so I just listen to a lot of like people talking about what it's like to design a game. And there is mysterious stuff that happens when you're building something really complex, in which you might, like, you don't even know why. You're like, okay, when I try to change this thing, for some reason it changes this totally other thing that I thought was unrelated. And so I'm not going to mess with it. Like when you play a modern video game, there's like all this sort of ghost code in there, which is like, you know what I mean? It's become like this big intricate system where you can't even like mess with things too much because you don't know what's all interacting with each other. I think sometimes they are like making a sound and they mess with something, and then for reasons they maybe don't even totally understand, it has this byproduct, this side effect elsewhere, and that is like fun to them. You know what I mean?
Totally. I completely agree with you. I think like, when I first started getting into Autechre and stuff, I really had that idea of like, the masterfully placing wizards, kind of thing. But you're totally right. Like I think like the AE lives have really obviously shown it. But like it is a lot more of a, jam band, sort of experiment kind of thing, and not having full control is what's interesting more than like if you had full control of it, you're not going to get those sort of ghost code sort of things, if you fully were able to handle it,
like accidents.
It's the same reason I like punk oriented music. It's people who aren't the greatest guitar player or whatever. So you find things that, you wouldn't normally do with those. I think that like is the same thing, but everything's computer here,
Well, exactly, right? Like, I mean, and I wanted to read this quote from this most recent interview that they did, which is kind of right on this topic, right? So Sean says, but now with the rise of DAWs, extremely deliberate production methods are the norm. That's why I'm more drawn to roughness, improvisation, and rawness. That's why we make our own software. I'm not saying I don't use DAWs at all, but I'm really interested in capturing moments. Moments are so precious. I don't know if it's because I'm getting older. When I listen back to my older work, I can hear those unique moments where I made a weird choice. It's like something that was almost impossible to recreate just happened, and I was able to document it. I really value that. Chorus Disc is a record of those moments, deliberately chosen without any technical constraints. It may not have been as successful as the albums that followed, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. So I feel like that explains it all. I mean, that is what obviously they're doing with 2022 Dash, but that is like, I think exactly what I hear nowadays when I listen to Exai is like, this is that rawness, that roughness, like those little accidents are happening and they are trying to capture that magic. I found myself thinking a lot about our conversation about set B of 2022 Dash and Lisbon especially, because remember we talked about that had like kind of a weird first draft roughness that was like kind of an exciting energy to it. And then when we listen to the Venice set, it sounds a little bit overworked and some of that magic is gone. Exai is like the first draft and that's the best thing about it.
Yeah, totally. And I think, that may be why they aren't playing, each of the sets like a ton of times, like we talked about, like what was it, B, that was only played a handful twice. It's like, I think keeping that energy and that rawness and roughness around and alive is their their goal. And like they seem, if you're like that into experimenting and stuff, like I think like it's got to get boring once you get past like where there's nothing new to like really squeeze out.
No accidents are happening, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like it's got to just be kind of we were just going through the motions sort of thing now. So I get why they do basically a tour or even just a few dates around one specific set.
Yeah, maybe there are people out there who always felt this way, but for me, I had like this little eureka moment this week where it's like, I just feel like I'm looking at them like a slightly different way all of a sudden, and I feel like that's why we're doing this revisited series. I think it's really rewarding. The other thing I want to bring up front here, of course, is the sort of structure of this record. I mean, we got a lot of write-ins about this. We'll get to it, but like, do you think of it? I mean, is it just a giant data dump of like 2 hours of tracks? Does it have an overall, like over the course of the 2 hours flow? Does it work better or maybe even only work as those like 4 EPs that they described? How do you kind of think about this?
It feels like there's definitely some moments, and I have a few marked in my notes. We'll get to it as we go through the track listing. But there's a few moments where I'm like, oh, the transition between this one and this one is like pretty great. But I think with that whole 12-inch idea and everything, like it does feel like something you could mostly maybe put on shuffle. I think like the ending track. I can't think of all the letters it is. YYZ, Little Rush action. Like that, I think that's a really good like closing track. I honestly think like
Floor is a great opening track.
Especially like with that little bit of silence and stuff. But other than that, and like I said, I got a few spots I think I marked that are pretty good transitions, but this record is, I don't want to say samey, but it's definitely like using a similar palette, throughout it. Like all the songs sound like they're from the same session or the same, set of equipment or, software or whatever at the time, so like maybe those transitions just work because of that. It could again be just those accidents. But I think like, I don't like calling it like a data dump because that seems just like a toss off, like we didn't put any thought into this, but it's something in between that and meticulously track listing.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's kind of like, I guess this is almost what they probably like, is when it feels like two things at once or maybe even like three things at once, right? there is obviously just like a mammoth quality to this, like 1-2 hour just relentless experience, you know. However, it is very clear that there is like a kind of pause between Blade Laura's and 1-1 is.
Yeah.
You know, there's almost like 30 seconds of silence, and that's the halfway point. I think they're like inviting you to take a little break there, to be honest. Blade Laura's has a long kind of dreamy outro to it. You know, there is, however, I mean, weirdness in which, like, you know, I'm just looking at my notes, like TSXI, which is supposed to be the end of the first 12-inch of the first EP, so to speak. It like flows seamlessly into Vecco S, which is supposed to be the start of the next EP, you know? So it doesn't even like, you could divide it up into these EPs. I think sometimes that's interesting and rewarding to do, but you totally don't have to. You could take a break in just in the middle instead, or you could go all the way through. I think that totally works. But do you like the EP approach? I guess my thought is, all right, next week we're going to do, or next time we're going to do an entire episode on Elevant, which if it really is just another 12-inch from this session, like, do you feel like any of the, you know, 12 inches, quote unquote, would stand up to an entire week of just listening to that? You kind of get what I'm asking?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't listen to it that way at all. You know, right. I don't own this.
I just took a mental note, like, okay, this is supposed to be the end of that EP.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah. I did do that. You know, probably. I think like if you took any of these, you know, 12-inch portions and like said, okay, that's Elevant, and, you know, put Elevant where this is, like, I think it would be just as good. You know, there's no section here where I think like this only works because of the, you know, the greater whole sort of thing. You know, I don't think there's anything that's like, you know, a lot of times, like if you have, you know, a White Album approach record, you know, it's just sort of like there's a couple things like you would cut out, but because of, you know, that data dump sort of feeling, like they need to stay here. I kind of don't like get that from this. I like every song seems, you know, worth its place in the record, and I think it would.
But the question is,
you know?
like, could you listen to just Floor through TSXI like over and over again? You know what I mean? Or could you just listen to 1-1 is through SPL9? You know, these are what they're saying are like almost individual 12 inches. Would they actually stand alone, you know?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a question we can revisit when we do Elevant, you know, to see, you know, does Elevant stand up for, you know, us listening to it?
That's what I'm wondering.
Weeks,
I'm really wondering, because I don't even know if it's supposed to be able to, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm gonna guess that. Yeah, I think like, you know, any of these sections, you know, Fleur through test or what is it?
TSXI,
yeah. I think any of those like would be just as good as I think Elevant is in my mind, with the asterisks of I haven't listened to it since, you know, a year or two.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll test it out next time. We'll test out this theory. But yeah, I just found myself like, it's interesting because if you think about these as individual EPs, I mean, I think the first one works quite well. It tells this interesting story. I was trying to think like what would be the identity of each of these EPs. The first one I was thinking of is like dubstep aquarium or something. It's like there's lots of wubbing, but then like really dreamy bubbling sounds, especially as you get toward the end. The second EP I would just title 3 songs before Blade Laura's. I'm sorry, but I just don't think that one works at all as a like individual listening experience. Like the Blade Laura's just like totally overwhelms everything. The third EP, 1-1 is through SPL9. That one I think has a cool kind of interesting identity. There's a lot of like sweeping strings, like kind of, I don't know, Schoenberg-esque, like kind of discordant but romantic on that. And then the last EP is like very obviously, I mean, speaking of Sep B, like this is like the hip hop EP, you know, with Cloudline and Deco Loc and everything. I mean, we'll talk about them, but yeah, so I don't know. I'll be curious. We'll revisit this when we do Elevant, but I just feel like some of them actually work as EPs. Sometimes it's clear that that's actually not how you're supposed to listen to this, but I think the larger point is that they enjoy when the format is like ambiguous. Like it could be this, it sort of works as this, it's like kind of straddling the line or something. I wanted to put on the table some overall thoughts from listeners. We had a lot of write-ins about this record, of course. It's a one that people feel passionate about. Let's start with this sort of long one from EBCD, which is a good one though. They say, I view Exai as the first of a series of spiritual successors to Chorustus, the others being LSEC and NTS, given that all of these albums share the common characteristic of feeling a lot more disjointed, focused more on individual tracks than the whole picture of the album, and most, if not all, tracks being edited down from lengthy jam sessions and having multiple iterations where whether we've heard them ourselves or not. I think the album is mostly characterized by its very janky and erratic sound. A lot of the sound design on this album starts to feel much more organic and textured than it did during the stretch from Untilted to Oversteps, with the heavier use of sampled audio and found sounds. On top of that, I think a lot of the composition and songwriting also adds to this. While I don't think it's anywhere near as jittery or spastic as the likes of Confield or Draft, the shift to generative sequencing in Max causes the drum grooves to feel a lot less strict or repetitive. I think the harmonics and melodies have also changed pretty noticeably. The melodies in Exai start to feel a lot more long-winded and meandering compared to previous records with less coherent direction and more emphasis on just sort of wandering around a harmonic space. In terms of how it relates to 2022 Dash, I think the most obvious connection is that I think Exai sort of marks the beginning of the system as we know it today. You want to read the next one, Dan?
Yeah, Joe says, I think that this was a major moment where their software-based production took a major leap forward. Even at their most scary moments, LP5, EP7, and Confield and Draft all had these very clean and precise feels to them. As soon as Flourish starts, it sounds almost immediately like an even more hyper-advanced version of Acro Year 2, but then it gets muddied in this way that sounds more like Chiastic Era and even Trirepete in a way. They would go on to tighten up this aesthetic and take it to insane new levels on LSEC and NTS, and especially in the new live stuff.
Here's one from Rob who says, it's not often that you can recognize that something special is happening in real time. However, I remember thinking this a lot in 2013. I was beginning to despair of electronic music, but the litany of incredible albums that came out that year restored my faith and love for the art form. One of the first to come out that year was Exai, and it blew me away. For me, it's Autechre's most atmospheric headphone album. It's a great winter album. It's a profoundly urban album. It seemed to take aspects of Burial's reverb and space, Hyperdub's vibe of gritty London nights, and pass it through an AE filter. But this isn't a pastiche, this is almost a recognition, if not quite a celebration, of where urban UK electronic music was at this time. I want to pause here because I think this is such an interesting point. There is a lot of like Burial in this. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I mean, we just don't often think of Autechre, especially not for a long time, as being like tapped into what was going on in music or electronic music around them. You know, they always seem to like exist apart. But do you agree with Rob here that like maybe they found themselves inspired for the first time in a while with what was going on like concurrently?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely hear some of that, like the way Burial plays with like the space and reverb, and even, you know, like I always think of like the rain sort of sounds in Burial, and Autechre, you know, specifically talks about using like, you know, water sounds and things in this. Right. So I definitely wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, yeah, and it's also like the kind of, there's a lot of stuff on here, I guess most famously on Blade Low Res, where it's like, it's, you know, reverb, but it is an echo, but it is like a decayed version of the track, you know, like really disintegrating, or like William Basinski-esque sometimes, like falling apart. And that I think of as very Burial, you know, that it's almost like you're hearing the ghost of you know, a rave night or something that happened the night before or something. Like, I do feel a lot of that. And it raises such an interesting question about like maybe that kind of 2000s period in which, you know, I love it, you love it, a lot of people do, but a lot of people also feel totally alienated from the stuff Autechre did like in the kind of early 2000s. And I wonder if they just were like a little bit adrift because they were not that inspired by what was going on around them. They were just kind of following their own thing. And maybe the reason Exai resonated with people is because for the first time in forever, they like reconnected with the bigger, you know, what was going on in popular music. I mean, it's a thought we can keep thinking about. You want to read the next one from Peter?
Yeah, Peter says, I remember enjoying Oversteps a lot, and I kind of wondered if this more mellow and ambient Autechre was where they were heading as they got older. I didn't mind it, but it's not the Autechre I was obsessed with and got excited about in the early 2000s. When they released Exai, I wasn't expecting much, but was pleasantly surprised. Autechre, we're back. This album felt so packed and detailed. Maybe it was just the fact that this is where they started more or less abandoning the idea of making an album that fit on a CD, but it seemed like this one sounded so fresh and dynamic and not afraid to take its time to get you from the beginning of a track to its ultimate destination. I'd say my only complaint is that it might actually be too much. Nowadays, I listen to it as just one of the 12 inches at a time.
Here's listener Mike on the kind of format stuff that we started talking about. Mike says, it's interesting to think of this as a double LP. They do have some intros/outros to suggest that, and overall the W Reverb production does unify the tracks. Fleur through Flep are kind of hit and miss in my book. I do like Jada VC and parts of Earlight Get Zero, but I can't put those on without getting an itch to skip to Twin Horizon, and then I just let the album play without feeling like I should skip forward. But what do you guys think? Is this better thought of as a double LP, or does it work better as a collection of tracks? Avery had a similar kind of comment on the similar topic. Avery here, I wrote the comment on how I thought this album was mid back in our original coverage of this. I think it's one of their more disappointing releases since Incunabula. When I went in for the re-listen, I went in with good faith because I do want to understand the hype, but yet again, I was scorned by some of the baffling choices in the latter half of the record. So I just thought it was interesting there, and we'll come back to this, and we already started talking about it, but like, here's Mike saying, it doesn't quite work for me until we get to the latter half. And then we have Avery saying it works for me, until we get to the latter half, right? Like, I just think that this record has this weird kind of like Funhouse Mirror quality where it's like, it's going to work differently for different people or something. But you want to read the last one from Sunil here?
Yeah, Sunil says, Choristus marked a new approach, but Exai was when it hit full stride. Easily one of their best albums, if not their best. There's enough variety to keep things engaging, but enough common threads to keep it feeling cohesive. The 2 hours seem to fly by.
So then there's the third option, right? That Sunil says that I can listen to start to finish. I mean, again, it's like, I kind of like that, right? Where it's like, you can do it all the way through. If that's not for you, you can carve it up. They've given you some options. I wish to God they would do this for 2022 Dash, honestly. Like, give me some division points, for those people who sometimes feel overwhelmed or you don't have all this time. I think that is one of Exai's strengths, actually, that it can serve a lot of different purposes for different people,
No, totally. I mean, I even just personally listening to this, I most of the time over the last 2 weeks, I listened to it as like the 2 CDs, basically up to Blade Loras and then the second half. Mostly, as I always say, my walk's about an hour, so it kind of worked perfectly to do it that way. But also even just like, you don't always have 2 hours. I don't always feel like listening to this for 2 hours straight. So I do appreciate that there are like, there's sort of 3 different ways to listen to this. You can either do the CD and split it in 2, do the record and split it into 4, or, I guess do the digital and do all 2 hours at once. I really do appreciate that. And yeah, that's something that's certainly lost with 2022 Dash.
And that to me is like, that is the platonic ideal of an Autechre record. Like, if you could do the vinyl and that's one listening experience, you could do the CD, that's another experience. You could do the digital, that's another experience. I feel like it works pretty much in all of those, but I feel like they I don't know, they just almost never nailed that quite as well as they did here. But we can dive into the tracks now. There's a lot of other big picture stuff that I'm sort of saving for when it comes up naturally. But we'll start with track 1, which is Fleur. I want to read some of the stuff from AE Pages, not all, but just some of the notes that I think are kind of interesting trivia facts for our discussion. AE Pages writes that Fleur was done fully in Max MSP, which the guys confirmed in an Ask Autechre Anything. That's not always the case on this record. A lot of write-ins about this one. Get them on the table. Listener Joe said, slap in the face, welcome to Exai. Even Acroyear was a more gentle lead-in than this because at least it had the long opening section. Only Feed 1 would ever outdo this as an aggressive opening track, at least out of the main albums. I have myself I was having the same exact thought, right? Which is like, it's one of those filter tracks that they like to do sometimes, like LCC of Untilted, which by the way, almost filtered you because you don't like that snare sound, but they sometimes like to start their records with like that kind of, you better be in or leave now, you know? And I agree with Joe totally that like Feed 1 is the definition of that, but Floor is another great one. You want to read Sunil's?
Yeah, so Neil says, action and motion, the low end sounds like a massive engine. Melodic elements are minimal but powerful. This one took a while to grow on me, but now it's one of my favorites.
Rob says, baptism of fire beats fired at you straight from the off. Large looming synths add a sense of size as well as intimidation. If you can handle this track, then you've earned the right to continue.
EBCD says, Floor has always been an oddity to me, although I think it makes a little more sense in the context of being just one track on a short 12-inch compared to the context of it being the grand opening of a double album. Even still, the choice to have the track basically lose all form and rhythm about halfway through as it becomes something closer to a sound collage kind of amuses me.
That is an interesting choice. We'll have to circle back to that. But finally, listener Avery says, I go back and forth on my thoughts on Floor, but it's pretty good. The best thing about this track is it's really fun to hear AE try their hand at a kind of drum and bass type sound with those gurgling bass lines and frenetic quick drums. I do think the track suffers from feeling a bit repetitive at points, and just putting the snare under a low pass filter feels a little lazy for AE track progressions given what they've done before, but the weird, almost harsh noise sound design at the end makes it up to me. You can hear peaks of pro radii with that heavily reverbed kick drum. What do you think of Floor, Dan?
I love the way it starts, you know, with that 5 seconds or so of silence. It tricks you into turning your headphones up, you know, too loud, you know, and then just immediately blasts you. You know, you're just thrown into the deep end, like some of the write-ins said. You know, you're just, it really it's filter, you know, like if you can handle this, then continue along your way, which is kind of nice of them, you know. Don't waste your 2 hours of your life if you can't handle it. But I love like the like skittering percussion that's here. It's just like so fast, manic. We got like this growling bass synths underneath everything. There's like a shimmery kind of like metallic sound on the percussion, which I think like kind of pervades a lot of the record. I think this track just like really sets up our palette and like our ideas super well. I think it's a great opening track.
Yeah, I think this is fantastic. All-timer. Just the most frantic, you know, wildly clattering percussion, and like what sounds like, you know, mixed in there is like frantic reversing and like spiraling of just a flurry of sounds. And then of course the best part though is the now classic AE time dilation effect, in which the steadiest like kind of wubbing bass, you know, suddenly fills everything in, and you know what was frantically chaotically fast is now very, you know, chill. I don't know. I just like absolutely love that contrast, and the, you know, the bass is just to me the best part of this. Of course, yeah, like you said, the kind of just rattling and stuff, and like also just squeaking dirty feedback, like all the scuzzy stuff that's kind of these artifacts that are flying off this whirring sounds all over your head. It's just such a rush, such a great start. I wonder though, what do you make of like kind of the interesting choice to, it sort of breaks down and we get just this kind of lone groaning bass. Maybe like it's like the wub is trying to get going, but it's just kind of sputtering out. It can't get going again. It's like a weird outro. A couple interestingly, like, I don't know, like noise explosions happen like in this kind of breakdown part, which is kind of cool. But you know, it's a pretty short track, and then it's even shorter because it actually ends a little bit early and just sort of sputters out for a minute or two. What do you make of that?
I think that's like, again, like I said, like this track sets up like the palette of this record pretty well. And I think like a lot of the songs here either do like a thing where it almost completely switches, you know, at some point in the track, or there's a few too that do that like sort of Basinski out kind of thing. And so I think like here that switch up is kind of like, you know, maybe a light version of that. You know, this track is, like you said, a bit, it's only 4:51, where some of those other ones that do that trick, you know, are 10-minute plus and whatnot. But I think it's like it's a real good like setup, you know, an appetizer of like what they're gonna do for the rest of the record.
Yeah, I guess it gives it like a prologue kind of quality a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, well, then we'll move right into track 2, which is called Earlight Get Zero. A note from AE Pages says, the track was done by Rob, which he explained was all full on Max MSP, AE homemade modules, etc. Lots of samples mixed and played with. When later pressed about the melodic line, he mentioned it was a hand-played response to the rig-built bass playing. That's very interesting. To get our listeners on the table here, EBCD says, Earlight has a solid opening that effectively establishes the album's overarchingly grimy and erratic sound with its sort of chugging and stuttering bass line that sounds to me like something in between a robot coughing and singing. I really like the moment the drums come in with its flashy and banging snare, and I think the track really puts its best foot forward. I enjoy it all the way through, but don't have much to say about its later parts.
Rob says about 5 minutes in, you get this atmospheric feel that suggests the influence of Burial or Hyperdub. The sense of space is really notable after the claustrophobia of Untilted from a couple weeks ago. There's a real sense of reverb, echo, and air. This tune seems to offer hints of that standing outside the venue vibe that you get from Burial, while stabs of synths hit you. Around 7 minutes in, you get another shift. This is reminding me of the triptych style of Kindred, where one track can have distinct movements within.
Listener Sunil says, this is one of my all-time favorite Autechre songs. When I first heard it, it sounded amorphous, but it's perfectly crafted to me now. The fat, knob-twiddly low end and the airy snares, the dramatic melodies, the eerie pads, the whole experience is like a huge epic journey.
Joe says a really cool epic journey through some terrifying realm, hopefully with some good friends to ward off the existential and other types of terror. I just love the trick of parts coming in and out that makes you totally lose track of where you are or where you're going.
Listener Avery says, the track that has the earliest ongoing symptoms of this record, it's fine overall and nowhere near the worst of the more amorphous beats on this album, but it feels a little boring. I think a lot of my bitterness to this track is mostly built off of what it isn't, though. At the beginning, you hear these retrigged, clattering industrial noises and this funky bass rhythm, but then it moves away from that entirely, and part of me is annoyed that it changed because the rest of the track does not get as much enjoyment out of me as those first couple of seconds do. So this is our first kind of juggernaut. I mean, to sort of counter the claims that this is not supposed to work like one big 2-hour experience, they've clearly put a couple of these kind of anchor tracks, spaced out, where it's like occasionally there's a big mammoth track that like the tracks around it, you know what I mean? It also serves as like a little peak at some point, which I think works really well. But what do you make of Earlight, our first like 10-minuter?
Well, this is one I noted that I think like Floor transfers pretty good into this one. It's pretty nice transition. But as for the sound of this one, like I like the delay on this, like that snare. It's like really bright and just like hollow kind of knocking sounds going on, very energetic. That bass synth is cool. Once I learned like that the melodic line is hand played, like I feel like you can really kind of hear that. It really does like sound like this weird moment of like humanity within this, such a robotic kind of thing in there. I do like that like false ending sort of, where it switches about 4 minutes in, gets a bit more droney. We still got that bass synth going. There's like string type notes going, percussion coming and going. I like this one. I think it's one of the better tracks towards the front of the record.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, the snare I think is like the most striking thing. I wrote down that it sounds to me like ripping paper or something. It's got this like
okay, I can see
sound,
that.
and it's like really hype, honestly, because it's got a quick, like, kind of stomping beat, really crunchy with this ripping paper thing. And then, it feels like, I don't know, just quick pace. And then when those kind of synth licks, kind of harpsichord-esque, like kind of soloing over the top joins in, it just feels like there is tremendous, like, energy in this. And, it just is like a real rush, I think. Great way to kind of start us off if the last track was more of like a prologue, which I think it kind of was. Really interesting, though, to learn that it is hand-played, some of this soloing. It reminds me, right, we had these discussions about most of the tracks on Envain had like an interestingly improvised, like kind of keyboard solo quality over the end of them, which I thought of as really unusual. So it's funny to see it here. And yeah, I couldn't help but think that it has a kind of, it almost sounds algorithmically generated. There are a couple of times on my notes where I wrote down like, this is either algorithmically generated or played in a way that really sounds algorithmically generated. You kind of get what I mean? Like, doesn't it? It sounds like weirdly unnatural as opposed to like Envain, which I thought was very impressively musical. But the fact that they played it means that that's exactly how they wanted it to sound. You know what I mean? Do you agree? It kind of sounds like generated, right?
I think like, I definitely didn't like notice it was hand played until I read it. But it does feel like sort of, can't think of the word for it, but like off a little bit. But I think, once you learn that it's hand played, I think like in the context of everything that's going on here, like to play along with it, I kind of get that. I don't know. It's like the time kind of drags a little bit on it. But I could see, especially in the context of Autechre, like why you would think it's generated,
Yeah, and I think it's just because of like the wubbing bass, it sort of shifts and changes like in kind of illogical ways, like ways that make me feel like a computer is in control or a system is in control or something. And the fact that the soloing kind of like this harpsichord thing over the top, follows right along with these like nonsensical chord changes or something. It sounds like inhuman to me, but I don't know. It's at the same time, the whole thing is kind of like evolving and like oozing in this very organic way. I know some listeners don't like when we use that term, but I don't know. I think that's what I like about this track is that it's sort of like conflicting to my brain. Like, is this human or like totally robotic, or it's like somewhere in the middle. The best part though, I think, of this track is one of the listeners mentioned it, but there's this kind of long pause. Actually, this has kind of a Burial quality. You know how Burial does those like long tracks that are like kind of episodic, like the whole thing stops and then kind of starts back up again. So this does that a couple times. And yeah, the middle section, you get what sounds like kind of a distant sort of church organ, kind of playing over the top. And to me that like, I don't know, it almost makes the whole track. I just think that is so spooky or something. It's very sinister, especially when the beat slams back in. I mean, there's something goddamn, I wrote down like, is this the most evil Autechre song? I mean, it really has that quality.
I think like in the same way as Burial, and somebody mentioned it in the email we read earlier, like this really is like a headphone record, at least to me. And I on this track in particular, like that delay I mentioned on the snare, it's in headphones is so cool. Like it feels like it's not going just from like one ear to the other, like left to right or right to left. It's kind of like staying in one, but I don't know. It's like it's going at an angle into through your head or something. It's hard to explain, but I think it does such an interesting thing. Like if you just pay attention to that snare itself, like in your headphones.
That's funny because you know what, I was feeling like this sounded so good on my sound system that I usually do like a headphone listen of everything before we talk about it as well. But I was like, I'm not even gonna, if it's not broke, I'm not gonna fix it. You know what I mean? Like it sounds so perfect to me. I'm not even gonna do a headphone listen.
Nice.
But we'll move on to track 3, which is called Prac F. AE Pages had this to say. Sean noted that he completed the track quite quickly, just burning through it. That was a quote. He also humored a possible Prac F and Osla for N connection. That's one of the tracks on the Elevent EP. I guess somebody must have asked, like, I don't know, these remind me of each other. He said, well, they were both done a few weeks apart. I guess that's like kind of a no, but kind of a, I guess I see what you're saying. To get the listeners on the table about this one, listener Joe said, this one reminds me almost of the symbiotes from Spider-Man, this sinister, dripping, liquid-like solid that feels like it's oozing around and slowly developing into different forms. At first glance, it might feel like this song goes nowhere, but it's like sitting in one place and watching alien shadows develop and morph on the wall.
Avery says Prac F is when we start getting to the unambiguously good tracks on this album again. It's fun hearing this because it feels really predictive for this upcoming era of Autechre. Also, I like that it feels like there is actually stuff going on in this track. Stuff is changing in interesting ways, and it never feels like I'm listening to the same thing over and over again.
Listener Rob said, atmospheric discordant drums with effects coming in and out over the top, then the heavier clanks and beats after 2 minutes. The tune is getting more seismic, growing towards something. Then these start to fall away into just the effects rather than the heavier beats.
EBCD says, a track I probably have a little more respect for than I think most would, given that I have a soft spot for tracks where it sounds like Rob and Sean just shit posting on main. I think it's goofy and aimless. Beat is fun, and I like the part halfway through where the track suddenly gets really heavy out of nowhere.
And listener Sunil said, I initially found this one forgettable, but now I think it's great, very liquidy. It's interesting, yeah, that Joe and Sunil both thought of it as liquidy. Yeah, this is like, maybe the first of the, it's a similar length to Floor, but it's like the first of these tracks that's kind of, a short one, like a little quick shot or something, kind of like gets lost in the shuffle, but in a good way. I think it's a really interesting one. It's got a kind of like a little thump of like a little plucky, thumpy, kind of like almost palm muted kind of riff to it. It really is krautrocky to me. I mean, I feel like there's something like about Can's Paper House or something. It does the same kind of like, thumbed sort of low string thing. But yeah, I think it was EBCD talking about the like goofy and aimless beat. It's got this weird lopsided off balance quality, which reminds me a lot of a couple things on 2022 Dash. I'm especially thinking of that weird track L Semp or whatever that was. That's got this kind of like off balance beat. The other thing that's interesting about this is that it, the snare sounds like, I don't know, to me like a sample of a car door slamming or something. Normally I would assume that they made that sound, but because they have said that they used a lot of little samples of like everyday things, I can't help wondering maybe that really is a car door. I wonder, speaking of this being like the start of the quote unquote system, do you think that they basically just stop sampling because they get good enough at sound design with the system to like not have to anymore? You kind of get what I'm asking? Like at this time, it was so new to them that they actually found themselves using more recorded things.
I was thinking about that like throughout the week, because as far as we know, they don't really do much of that anymore, at least that we hear or know about. But yeah, I was thinking about that, I feel like if I, just started working with a new program, like I would probably rely, on a basis more than with just white noise, to learn and everything. So it makes physical sense. Like I wonder if it's more a artistic choice or a, necessary choice.
Yeah. To me, it's like more, for my theory that this is like Exai is like a rough, first attempt or something with this, with a system that's kind of new to them and not totally in their control. Yeah. I think it's really hard to, if you're exploring something like that, to start from like zero, just start from white noise every time, to have stuff to some like sounds to sometimes build around, or, I think that would be like kind of a good way to get started. I just imagine nowadays, if they want like a car door slam type sound, they know how to make that probably. But at this time, maybe they didn't. Just a total guess. But what do you think about Prac F in general?
This is one of the like songs I would classify as being like, a white album kind of thing. Like it maybe doesn't stand up like on its own, but in the context of this greater whole, I think it fits in. So it's not like one of my favorites or anything, but it's good. I really do like, you sort of mentioned it, the drums, percussion on this, like it really does that like time dragging sort of thing, where it like feels like it's getting out of beat. Like I really enjoy when that happens in Autechre, and it's a little krautrocky, like you said too, and I also like that. So yeah, this is sort of like a B tier kind of track, I would say, I guess.
Yeah, some great atmosphere though. I mean, there is like this kind of buzzy kind of feedback sort of like hanging over the top, and it's interesting because it's quite murky, this record, quite dirty, scuzzy. It honestly made me think of 2022 Dash as like, Exai is like the start of murky AE. I saw somebody just not that long ago complaining on the Reddit about the fact that Autechre used to make music that was like so pristine. You think of like LP5, right? It just sounds flawless, perfect sound design. And on 2022 Dash, things often sound kind of rough. And I've seen people complain and say, like, I don't think this is mixed very well, actually, maybe as a result of like they're recording something live. But I think that it's part of like, that's the shared DNA between Exai and 2022 Dash, is that it is a little dirty and scuzzy and rough because that's what they were going for. But anyway, long-winded way to say that I think this track is very murky, but like still manages to create a lot of atmosphere, as even some great, lo-fi music can do. We'll move on to track 4, Jada VC. Our listeners had this to say. Listener EBCD said, this always has been a highlight to me between both its jazzy chord progression and sputtering drums and bright organ chords that seem to be totally unquantized with how they refuse to synchronize with the rest of the track. I've also grown to appreciate the track's second half with its clumsy and crude kick drums and splattering snare on top of the eerie music box sounding melody playing throughout it.
Sunil says it's such a cool moment when you hit Jada VC because the album has been pretty dark and gritty up to this point, and this song is so immediately bright. It feels like when you hike up a mountain and suddenly come across a beautiful view. It's also rhythmically really interesting, evokes imagery of something like an alien child's wind-up toy.
Both the listeners had some like kind of music box metaphor to make. Listener Joe said, this one really captures the lo-fi feel of the album, like I mentioned last week about Colma, where it almost feels like you're playing it through shitty speakers or headphones in a really cool way that makes it feel like you're experiencing it in the real world.
Avery says, Jada VC continues the line of good tracks. The composition of the harmony and melody are really fun and give it a lot of replay value. And the drums are fun, a little simple, but still keep some twitchy AE aggressiveness in them to keep it from feeling too basic. I also enjoy how the drums are layered with these little wubbing noises under them.
And listener Rob said, the UK music scene of the moment is so apparent in this track. The melody that begins the tune, the big, and I do mean big beats that come in, and then the wubbing bass. I can picture this being played out of rude boy cars around the streets of Essex as their subwoofers shake the windshields loose. This is so reminiscent of a time and place as to be almost as nostalgic as Envain. This is a personal favorite as it reminds me of home. This one, I think it was Sunil who had brought it up as like kind of a sudden bright spot. It has a similar effect to, I can't remember the name now, but there is a track on Pansonic's Colma that we just talked about that does the same thing, where like suddenly the luscious, most pretty synth, right, is like such a surprise to hear it. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, I think they do that very well in this. Like it stops. I said at the start, like this record has like a really like kind of defined palette, but I think like especially over 2 hours, if we're just in the gritty muck of everything completely the whole time, like it's going to get very samey. So like you mentioned, like when we get this like such a nice big synth pad going and everything, like it really. At first, like I think it gives you like a little bit like, does this fit here? And it's more listening. It fits perfectly and like really expands the album and everything. I think it's like this is the kind of stuff that makes this like next level records.
Yeah, that's nicely put. Yeah, just these lush. I mean, I think of them as straight out of Oversteps. These like kind of synth swells. There are these kind of cascading chords that are kind of layered on top that are just gorgeous, and then this like weird kind of octave clang thing, like dun 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 dun, like kind of running up and down. It adds like, I don't know, like this almost watery, like underwater feel. Very dreamy, this track. And yeah, the beat. One of the listeners had put it really well, but it's just a really like dirty slamming beat, like a real wonderful crunch on the kick, really big clack on the snare. If it has another kind of like slightly off balance kind of quality to it, just like the last track. And there's actually like a nice smooth transition between Prac F and Jada VC that like, you kind of agree with me. It's like, okay, maybe on their own, either of those two would be somewhat easy to overlook. But I almost think of them as like kind of flowing right into each other, and it makes like this awesome suite of music, right? Like so much of this record.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think like the B-side here, pretty much the whole thing, these 3 tracks, Prac F, Jada VC, and then the next one, TSXI, they like really do, these are our White Album, sort of things like I was saying. And yeah, they like maybe on their own don't seem like, big standouts or anything, but I don't know, just in the context of, the way they're transition, everything, it again just really elevates this.
Yeah, and I wrote down that like at the end of this track, that kind of weird octave bounce sound. This doesn't make any sense, but I wrote down it's getting octavier because it just gets like more twisted and weird, and like the end of the track just gets like, I don't know, you start to see like that kind of funhouse mirror, like it almost feels like you're now looking through the track and it's getting kind of warped and bent. And these are the things that like Max MSP lets you do that you just couldn't do before, I think, where it's like the whole thing starts to ooze and like amorphously change shape and everything, and you just hear them like having fun with that. But we move into track
real quick. I think that's like the genesis of the jam band thing. We talk about with Autechre. Like doing that. Like that's where it like the meat of that comes from.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we move into track 5, which is the last track of the first EP, if that's how we want to think about it. We can see if we agree that this is a good sort of closing spot. AE Pages had these things to say. The sequencing in TSXi was mostly done in Logic as opposed to Max. Interesting. They also said the first track on Hanel Gig is TSXi with a longer outro, which was cut off on Exai. When asked about details, Sean noted that it was made in 2011. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Dan. I wasn't until I was reading about this. And one of our listeners wrote in about it as well. But they did some gig like at a friend's party or something. And Sean had brought like a little CD of basically tracks that he was working on, but then there's also stuff that wasn't his own tracks and stuff. And he like accidentally left it in the laptop and it got leaked. And so there are a couple kind of early Exai versions. So that's sort of interesting. If you want to see
I didn't know that. Yeah.
They also had this to say, AE Pages. The main harmonic progression of the track consists of a 16-bar progression, which is repeated twice, after which every repetition moves the entire progression one semitone down from the previous loop. Sean notes that he was just playing around with the original loop and felt it sounded more plausible to have it go down a semitone. To get into our listener Avery said, easily the best song on the album. What a claim. And essentially the peak. The harmonic progression is really good. I especially like the way it doesn't just loop, but repeats down a half step each time. Adds to the sense of movement in this track that a lot of other parts of the album fail at. The beat switch at the end of the song is really fun. I like that the kick sounds like plastic and the water splash noise used for the snare. It's cool how this also feels like a love letter to Confield.
Sunil says, I love this one. Somehow it feels very cerebral.
Listener Rob says, another favorite as it has aspects of earlier Warp with a pretty simple melody with glitchy IDM beats and tones playing over it. This is almost old Autechre and is pretty accessible. After 4 minutes, it all drops away to leave the beats and a harpsichord sound effect playing. The echo on these tones and the footstep sounds toward the end of the track also give this sense of air or space.
Joe says this is the underrated heart and soul of Exai that really sums up the entire identity of the album, which is this sometimes deceptively sunny here, especially at first, clean digital sound that can get as grimy as Autechre ever does, but still just always feels slick and smooth with some of their best beat making. I wish I had smarter, better words to describe how awesome this all sounds, so I'm counting on you guys.
Well, what do you think of this one?
Oh, you're going to put it on me. This one, I feel like these last three, like I sort of already said it, but like, go together. They all sort of like have that kind of, not like, just filler or whatever, but I don't know a better way to put it, but I do like this one's like got that real like watery kind of sound, which I think, relates it to Jetta VC. Just a very nice melody, bubbly. Again, like one of the listeners said, it does like that it has the dichotomy of Autechre, the like really kind of lush, nice sounding things, and then also, can get as grimy as it can get. What do you think?
Yeah, because it does get really weird at the end. In fact, it sort of follows like the same sort of structure as Jetta VC just did, in which It starts off very pretty. This is like a moment where the keyboard sound played. Like it sounds like a genuine, just very pretty, like simple melody. I think it was Rob said this reminds me of old Autechre. This is the kind of thing you would hear them, do before, like one of those pretty melodies they're capable of just tossing out. And then you get this kind of, like bubbling quality, like this kind of glitchy bubblings on the surface, and then these sort of big bubbles, like these big splashes of synth, and it gives, like you said, like that whole underwater feel, which we sort of started up with Jada VC. In slams this really great like boom bap kind of hip hop beat. I love like there are these kind of blown out like tom rolls kind of mixed into the beat. It really sounds like it's playing through like an old boombox or something. Real cool, like kind of throwback, and maybe even like a little preview to some of the more like overtly hip hop stuff at the end of this whole record. But then, it starts to get like kind of twisted. There are these like high plink sounds, and they just get like, sort of detuned. It sounds like eventually there's this kind of, almost like sounds like a harmonium kind of swelling, and just has this, everything's getting detuned, like going sour. I wrote down in my notes, and just kind of ends in this weird. Yes, some of our listeners, I forget, had mentioned like, this kind of toy box or like junkyard kind of like just clatter of percussion thing. So it goes from really pretty to weird in a wonderful way. And like you said, these last couple tracks can blend together, but this is what I love about this record is like, okay, Earlight is like a juggernaut. It kind of stands on its own, but these next three tracks, together, they make this, like, if we want to call it the first EP of the record, it tells like kind of a cool story. It kind of has like it starts like quite crazy. It gets quite pretty and dreamy. It ends up kind of twisted and weird as it started in a different way. What do you think that like of this kind of first, if it is an EP or like a 12-inch that can stand on its own, do you think this one stands on its own?
Yeah. I think like if this was, just another one of the tons of EPs Autechre has, like, the problem with all the EPs is like, people tend to overlook them. But I think like it would be just as well received as Elevant is, like the fans that are going to listen to EPs are going to be excited about it. I think it like it, like you said, it flows pretty well. The only thing is, Fleur is maybe the one thing that's slightly different, but we said too though, like I think Fleur goes into Earlight pretty well as as like a prologue, and that's the A side, those two together, and then the B side being these three. I think the B side definitely works super well together, as a standalone EP. The only thing is I don't know if you could like switch the A side with another set of song, another side later of the record. Like I'm not so sure that the A and B like need to be married together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the B definitely feels tight. It really does feel like a nice suite of songs. One of maybe the best suites of the whole record. I kind of feel like, I would sort of disagree with you that like, I think if this was released as an EP on its own, I think it would be a step above like Elevant level for a lot of people. I think Elevant gets overlooked a lot. I think people would see this as like another classic AE EP, to be honest with you. But we'll see how the next one holds up. We'll move right along. We got a lot of tracks to go still. Track 6, Veko S. This one seems to be the start of some more divisive tracks. So listener Rob said, this is what I mean about Exai being an album and not just a selection of bangers. Would I search this tune out on its own? No. Is it perfect for this part of the album? A resounding yes. It shakes things up and is an absolute banger compared to the previous two tracks. Cobwebs are shaken loose and the power of beats and manipulation of the tones is outstanding. After about 4 minutes, the drums drop away and this creepy atmosphere seems to wash in like a creepy fog or mist. It triggers such paranoia, like walking alone through a British housing estate in the dead of night. Are you being watched or sitting on the last bus home when a group of scary teenagers get on and you realize you are cornered and they start staring your way? All of it scary, all of it urban.
Joe says this feels like a preview of the stuff they would do on NTS 2 and 3, but a much more lo-fi, murky version. The last part of the track reminds me a ton of Gloss Ceramic, where it almost feels like it launches into space at the end and starts traveling to a different star system.
Listener Sunil says, I think of Prac F, Vecco S, Flep, and Twin Horizon as belonging to the same family of liquidy synth tracks. Vecco S is on the looser and funkier side. Yeah, this is one of the first like truly weird ones on this record. Another maybe filter track. Absolutely booming, kick. Really reverbed kind of clack snares. I think the most interesting thing about this beat, like this kind of snake rattle sound is mixed in there. But very like kind of chaotic. There's even a bit where, it sounds to me like, I don't know, it could be a sample of like animals fighting or something. Every time I'm listening to this, I think that like there's like a cat fight like down the street or something, because you can hear this like kind of crazy sound in there. What's interesting, I love the comp that Joe did to gloss ceramic, because I agree that there's like this kind of, I don't know, like this almost like wobbly. I compared it in my notes to like an accordion or something playing, like these kind of deep notes that are sort of like, I don't know, rolling back and forth and kind of like in an algorithmic way, searching and wandering, but it adds like an interesting time dilation effect to like kind of the crazy clattering. And then there's like this slowly wubbing kind of thing. But overall, like, a weird track, right?
I really like this one. I think I like it because it's weird. Did you notice there's like, and maybe not because you didn't headphone it, but another thing that really headphone sold this one for me, there's like a voice that kind of comes through at some point in this. It's like, I think that's what it is. It's like I don't know. It kind of sounds like a ghost, or maybe my house is haunted. But it's like, I really only noticed it in headphones. Because it's pretty low. And stupidly, I didn't mark the time, so I couldn't tell you. But yeah, I like this one. I think like it kind of does that like through a wall sort of thing, like we were talking about. That like Burial is so great at.
Especially like, toward the end. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, yeah, exactly. Like that. Once it's in that drone sort of section, like, man, the percussion just like has like such a cool. I love that. Like it's a way to get like to do a drone, but like still have percussion. You know what I mean? Like I don't know. It's a cool trick. But yeah, I totally agree with the listener who said like this is a pretty a spooky one.
Yeah, and they kind of like low pass the drums like down in there's like kind of just hiss, and I sort of compared it in my notes to like a gas leak or something. And it makes for this kind of, it sort of is like. It almost follows like the same structure and model as Floor did at the beginning, which is interesting because now this is the beginning of the next EP, but this is like a much slower and heavier version of that same kind of idea, I think. But we move into what a lot of people view as like this track's companion track, which is track 7 called Flep. Our listeners had a lot to say. Listener Rob said, the title suggests that the listener should prepare for something pretty, like RDJ's Flim, but the rat-a-tat of the drums suggests violence, guns, darkness. After 3.5 minutes, you start to get to this sense of space or atmosphere as if you are being lowered into a well whilst listening to it. High-pitched noises are played like from a horror movie, makes complete sense after the paranoia of Vecco S. The way the drum beats seem to cut in and out at the end of this track, like you are blacking out and your vision is coming and going.
Avery says, Vecco S and Flep are when my larger issues with this album start to peak out. On an individual level, these tracks aren't horrible or even that bad, really, but right after each other really lowers the quality of them. You could play a 30-second clip of one of these tracks and hold me at gunpoint, and I would just give up my life because that's an impossible task.
Mr. Sunil said, the snares are interesting. They sound stacked on top of each other rather than rolled.
Mike says Flep and Vecco S are perfect examples of some of their tracks where I get this strange feeling like some complex arpeggio AI is playing the song and it's not actually being controlled by a human mind. I can only describe it as trying to solve a complex maze with no path to the exit. I don't hate the tracks that do this. It's just very hard to get into them as my brain loses the meaning and that sort of meandering. Pots and pans. You've brought up the idea of AI in Autechre's music. Do you think they use an automatic composer or generative music for certain songs or parts? I remember prior to Sign coming out that they would live stream on Twitch and they would play these really almost like generated music. It was very similar to tracks like Flep, just without any reverb or color.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a link to one of those in the show notes because Mike wrote back later with like a clip that he found on YouTube of these kind of clearly like generated music things that they would play on Twitch at this time. Maybe it will remind us of this. But finally, listener Joe said, maybe the most underrated Exai track, the way the incredible beat interacts with the spacey ambience is just totally insane. This is another one that uses the trick of sounding like you're hearing the song through a brick wall and it's almost disorienting. What do you think of Flip?
Yeah, it's energetic, super, really right out of the gate, big reverb on this one. It's like things are being chewed up by some big machine or something, just like springy, buzzy synth peeking through. It mostly percussion. I think it is like fairly consistent throughout. I don't really find it like too samey. I like it. It's like kind of a vibe out sort of thing. I think it works perfectly with Veko S. I think here is another example of like great sequencing on this record.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting choice to have them like back to back because they do feel like, they share DNA or something. This one, I kind of am like, the beat sounds like a Flip. I almost don't know what else to say. Like it sounds like a Flip to me. Like it's like this really deep kick and then these like fluttering clacks. I mean, it literally does kind of remind me of the track Flutter, the very early Autechre track. But yeah, lots of reverb on them. There's like amp buzzing and like alarm like buzzes kind of in there. And then I think the most interesting part of this track is that this kind of like buzzing sort of becomes a little funky. Like it has like this wah-wah effect on it. It has like this kind of clav type of a quality. And it's like kind of creating a little funk like in this weird, kind of frantic beat. But it almost feels like a funky track that just can't quite get funky. Like it keeps wanting to, but just can't get there. It sounds to me like like a Max MSP experiment or something, and I think that I like having tracks like this on the record, even though I would never go to this one.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I hate to keep saying this, but it's like another one of those things that like builds this. We've got this 2-hour monster. Like we're filling up this giant piece of music. Because you're right. This probably isn't one I would go to, but I think it in Veko's like it's a side of vinyl. They definitely share DNA. But I think like if you're again looking at this as like a 12-inch, I think that this side like kind of works pretty well.
Yeah, I like going back to the the floor style like. Craziness. I think it's like a nice spot to do that, especially after we had that like string of, I think, really pretty tracks. But we move into track 8, which is called, Twin Horizon. I mean, it looks like spelled weird, but a common interpretation of the title, as A.E. Pages says, is that it is phonetically pronounced like Twin Horizon. Rob mentioned that there's, quote, glottal shit on the bass line. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that's a real word or what, but that's what he said. To get our listeners on the table here, listener Joe said, this is a great little track that feels like the style they'd explore in much more detail on LSEC 1 and 4. It might get called a throwaway, but I think it provides the perfect palate cleansing interlude you need between Flep and Blade Lores. It's also kind of a bit of a banger.
Sunil says a similar sound palette to the previous 2 tracks, but it's much more focused and elegant. Love it.
Avery says, a lot more memorable than the prior tracks, and the beginning synth has actually gotten stuck in my head a surprising amount. The beat is fun, and it does the kind of abstract, dark sound this album wants to do, but actually well.
Rob says, almost starts like you are regaining consciousness somewhere. Is Exai a concept album and I didn't realize it until today? Sounds or distant dripping or pipes. Am I in a basement? Creepy effects and panicked beats. Where am I? This is a creepy track, very atmospheric. The last minute even has sounds like creaking doors and what sounds like high panicked tones.
And EBCD says, a track I'm more mixed on. I think I see its vision, and I like certain things such as the strange and playful melodies, as well as the loud as hell door slam snare. But every time I listen to this track, I cannot get over how fucking obnoxious and ear-piercing the open hat is. Genuinely a kind of baffling oversight on Rob and Sean's behalf, unless it was intentional for some reason. This track, I gotta say, it's like, I find this one maybe like the least memorable track on the album somehow. It's like, it's really short. It could be, I didn't think to look, but it is the shortest track on the record by some distance. And it feels like, I mean, I kind of agree with Joe that like it has this function to try, I don't think totally even successfully, but to kind of shift us from like flip mode to Blade low res mode. It does like a semi admirable job at that with like, you know, kind of like booming kick, like real snare smash. It's got kind of like a metallic and angular quality to the way like these, I don't know, blippy like melodies start sort of climbing up. And then this kind of interesting like metallic ringing that is like kind of, I don't know, surprisingly pretty. It's bouncy. It's like lush on one hand, kind of jagged on the other. You get what I mean? It's like they literally sat down and were like, we need something that's kind of half Blade low res dreaminess and lushness and half flip like jaggedness. And this is what it is. It's cool for what it is, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think this is a lower light on the record for basically all the reasons you just said. Yeah, it's fine. I do kind of like, you mentioned already like a door slam like kind of snare, like this one here I wrote, and who was EBCD did too. Like it really does kind of maybe sound like a sample or something there, which is interesting. But not my favorite.
Well, speaking of, you know, if it is indeed a transition, I'm excited to get to this next one. Track 9, Blade low res. AE Pages says part of the name likely comes from low res, a resonant low pass filter max module. This is why, you know, I kind of pronounce this like, I don't know, I feel like I'm saying like a made up Spanish word, Blade low res or something.
Yeah,
but,
same.
I'm trying to say low res, you know what I mean? But I don't know. Some people say Blade low res. Of course, it's all made up anyway. In a Pitchfork interview in August 2018, Autechre noted that they had a 2011 jam that later became Blade low res. And this is interesting. I did not know this. Okay. The reverb sound at the end of the track later reappeared on Splash and All End from NTS sessions 1 through 4. Everybody knows that, I guess. But this part, in fact, All End was done on the same day as Blade low res. That's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it makes sense that like NTS isn't just from like, you know, one session or something, you know, but I really like, I didn't expect them to be, you know, kind of that far apart.
I find it interesting because, well, we'll get into it, but the end of this track basically is All End. You know, it basically is just a dreamy kind of held thing. So it's almost like they did it and then somebody was like, all right, we held that for like 2.5 minutes. I would like to do it for an hour, you know, or like, I don't know how that happened, but okay. To get our listeners on the table, listener Rob said, sounds so big, stomping, and the space they create with the echo and reverb gives it a sense of scale. It has this epicness, and the church-like voices elevate this tune to rapture-like levels. If I were to belabor the concept album idea for a moment, have I awoken in a scary religious ceremony, the end of Wicker Man? The track just keeps building and building. That's ceremonial singing so huge, so haunting. This album is so dark and wintry. Blade low res just blows the listener away, and then fuzz on the needle. Everything collapses and is discordant until it builds again, a foreboding rebirth. Then the beat kicks back in. It ends in the only way it could. Transcendent tones wash the listener up. A sense of light, becoming, life, incredible. Any other band would finish with Blade low res as the epic set closer, but we continue.
So Neil says, I love Blade low res, but my favorite part is that growing choir-like pads in the first half. I always feel a little let down when they die out, so I don't enjoy the second half as much. It took me a while to notice, but Blade low res has a lot in common with Erlight Get Zero. The snares are similar. There's a fat, knob, twiddly low-end white noise, pads that half sound like human vocals, but Erlight is dark and heavy, while Blade low res is light and ephemeral. Is this what it sounds like when Erlight dies and its soul leaves its body?
And Avery said, the last gasp for air before the album truly gets bad. Blade low res is so good, even me being a contrarian can't make me dislike it. Easily one of, if not the best tracks on this album. This one is like, it's one of those instant classics. I mean, from the very first time I heard it, I knew that it was like a very special track. And this is what makes an album like this work. You know, if you're going to have like a White Album, you need every once in a while like a While My Guitar Gently Weeps or something. You know, you need like those kind of anchors that hold the whole rest of the thing up. This is like, you know, the anchor to end all anchors, because yeah, you know, it was like, I think it was Sunil was comparing it to Earlight, where it's like, yeah, there's something similar about these are like some of those big juggernaut tracks that are kind of nicely spaced throughout, but this one coming right at the center of the album, it is the centerpiece of the album. I feel like everything builds toward it and then everything kind of descends from it, and this thing wouldn't work at all if you didn't have a track like that, you know?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it is almost exactly what you said, you know, like you can't do that without this. You know, this is like what makes that work, having you know, something that just that makes the 2 hours you know, worth it. This is, you know, an obvious fan favorite, and you know, deservedly so. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, you can't have a flip without a Blade Low Res around the corner.
Yeah, exactly,
you know?
exactly.
So, I mean, you know, I'm sure everybody knows, right? They can hear it in their head as soon as we start talking about it, but I think what makes this track special, like I was kind of saying at the start of the conversation, is, you know, this big kind of thudding heavy beat where you can hear like the ghost of itself kind of underneath the beat. It is like haunted by itself. There is a lo-fi decaying echo, you know, in the empty space between each like heavy thud. Of course, the sort of snare hit has this kind of interesting like plinking note in it, which sort of shifts around over the course of the track. And it's like indicative of how this track is, which is like, weirdly for Autechre, they sort of thought everywhere they possibly could, like, how do we get more beautiful melody into this thing? They're not usually thinking like that, you know, but like even the snare has a melody to it. It is pretty, you know? And then of course the wubbing bass comes in, very like wet, squishy wubbing, you know, it sort of is like, they're like just playing with the, you know, the cutoff and the resonance and everything, to where it sometimes gets just like really squishy in your head and just so lush. And then sometimes like it's, you know, sinks down under the cutoff and gets more like a, you know, just like a deep drone underneath. And then, oh yeah, the sort of bubble pops and bubble bursts that sort of join as yet another melody. But I think the thing that makes it, I forget which listener said this, they mentioned being disappointed when it goes away, but just these lush, gorgeous strings. I mean, it gets like orchestral in the middle. It's again, like there were already 4 or 5 melodic layers, and then they add like the most beautiful string section over the top. I don't know. It's just, it's like a knockout.
Yeah, I mean, those strings too, like I think we've said it a lot, and I think a lot of people like think of this record as like a, you know, grimy, you know, dirty kind of album, but then it's got stuff like that that's just like, you know, some of the prettiest stuff Autechre's ever done. It really like, I don't know. Again, it like this elevates this record, and like, you know, we've moved into, you know, masterpiece territory, I guess.
Yeah, and then we end with like a mini all end, you know, because those sweeping strings kind of stall on like a high shimmering kind of note, and it just hangs there for the rest of the track. Eventually, like the beat disappears, and you just get this like shimmering thing hanging there, and it's like sort of disintegrating slightly, you know, it's kind of like decaying. That's of course what you spend an hour basking in when you listen to All End. And that's why I just find it interesting that it's like they clearly liked the idea of this as a drone, and they thought, let's end this track with a little drone. But then there was something about them was like, you know what, let's also, in case we ever want to use this, let's put down to tape like a full hour of just holding this, because they were clearly obsessed with it. I mean, how often do you hear like a band do something and then like, you know, end up making an entire disc out of that one idea? You know, it's so like something about them. Yeah. It transfixes them, in other words, as much as it transfixes all of us.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that droney outro, I think is so cool here. I mean, I love All End as well. And I think, again, you know, we've reached the end of another 12-inch. And I mean, that's such a good way to go out, you know. Here too, you know, we're in a shorter record, and so Blade Low Res, like having that all in kind of thing, but a little quicker, and then to move to NTS, which is Exai, on steroids, and to end with like kind of that same thing, but stretched to a giant length is like just a really cool like through thread in their discography.
Now, what do you think though of this as like an EP? I think the first disc, so to speak, the first vinyl, it I think works really nicely, like we talked about. This one, like I described at the beginning, half jokingly, half seriously, it's like 3 tracks before Blade Low Res, because I really don't see the relationship. Like, we don't justify going from Vecco S to Blade Low Res. You know what I mean? It just, this to me works least well if you're trying to divvy it up.
I think I agree. I think this is like the worst of the discs because they don't work together all that much. I mean, I think so. This disc is where we said, brought up the White Album so many times, because this is sort of in that time. But I think also too, like in the, if you look at it as a full 2-hour record, like this is the time in the album, where you're gonna put that kind of thing. You don't want to start with the boring tracks, and you don't want to end with them. They're gonna get kind of stuck here in the middle. So I think like this works well in the the digital 2-hour version. Maybe works the least well in that vinyl version, and I think it's okay on CD. Like I said, I spent a good portion of my time listening to this as like, I would listen to this first record.
It's a good like pause point for sure.
Yeah, like I would listen to this first one, I might listen to something else for a little bit, or do whatever, and then start the next one. So I think it works well in the CD way too, but yeah, maybe least effective on vinyl.
Yeah, it feels like it feels like the Blade Low Res single really is what this one is.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
Stuff is like some extras.
If it was a 12-inch with just some kind of tossaways on there, yeah. I mean, that's exactly what you said.
All right, so we move into the second half of the record and the third like little EP here with track 10, which is called 1-1 Is. According to AE Pages, this was confirmed to be done by Sean alone. Interesting. This is what our listeners had to say. Rob said, a big pause between tracks, time to catch your breath. 1-1 is a close claustrophobic track whose tones sweep from ear to ear in my headphones. Faint alarm tones in the background make me think that someone is ringing my doorbell whilst I listen to this album. The space in the tune opens up a little after about 2 minutes with bell-like tones that warble and hold. Is this a good choice to follow Blade Low Res? It is certainly more thoughtful, slower, perhaps calmer. Then after about 4.5 minutes, everything is industrial, stomping steel, an approaching iron giant, grinding metal, squawking shards as the track stomps and plods towards its end.
So Neil says, another all-time favorite, so beautifully evocative, but so alien. It's especially trippy on headphones, but it sounds great anywhere.
Yeah, to the point of Rob and Sunil, actually, this is like one that even on speakers, you can hear kind of the play with the stereo field on this one. EBCD says, 1-1 has grown on me a lot recently. I used to be sort of indifferent, but it might be my favorite on the album. The intro still gives me goosebumps the way it sounds on headphones. The high-pass filter combined with the bizarre panning of the track makes it feel like the beat is slithering into your head or something. The snare on this track is really great. How it has this sort of dragging momentum to it, like each hit of the snare feels like it's heaving its weight through the track, only becoming more prominent later on when the beat switches up. I think this also has some of the best melodies of any track on the album. It has more control and direction compared to other tracks, like I could sort of hum an approximation of the tune.
Joe says, this song is such a totally incredible intro to disc 2. The ending is one of the best moments on the album, and maybe the best sound effect of the album is when the eerie synth gets drawn out at the end of every melody line.
What do you think of this one? 1-1 is.
I mean, 2 listeners said it, but like the headphone thing on this one is crazy at the beginning. Like the first time I was going through it this week, I was walking, and it just like, I don't know, it was like so it's like so disorienting, and like I had this feeling of like are my headphones messed up? Because like and I've talked
something.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I got Bluetooth. You ever have like one of the ears like doesn't connect right or something? I was like, oh man, is it doing that? It just like has this. I've talked about it like on the podcast before. They do this kind of trick through a lot of tracks, but it's like it feels like it's coming from like below or to the left and below of you. Like, I don't know. They get like such a spatial design with just two speakers that I like really honestly don't fully understand. And it's I don't know. It's such a cool trick. I am glad you said it works on speakers too, though. But again, I like the shuffling snare we've got on this one. Like the snare beats like kind of drag out a bit, like they're stretched. Those bell-like sounds are great, just huge, hollow. I like the change that comes around 4.5. Like it's like a slow machine, clanging like an engine. This like kind of klaxon sound coming in. I honestly, I'd like a all-in sort of loop of this end piece.
Yeah, it's like it's got kind of an interesting relationship to Blade Lowres, actually. I think that kind of like lumbering beat to it is kind of similar to what Blade Lowres was like, but it's very like intricate, actually, this one, because there's like these sweeping kind of swishes through your head or through the stereo field, this kind of plucky low like melodic line. The snare is like kind of a big wipe sound, and I especially actually like, sometimes it like sort of resolves into this big buzzy like bass bomb, actually, but it just feels like it almost has like I don't know, like a slint type of a quality where it's like this interlocking all these little rhythms and melodies and stuff. If Blade Lowres is like really dense, this is really intricate, instead, right? And then it sort of shifts into, I think it was Rob was saying, like, to this like all of a sudden this industrial stomping machine kind of quality. It's like the whole track gets like chopped up to where it is just becoming these Swans-esque like slams over and over again. It raises an interesting question I wanted to bring up as kind of like a big picture thing, which is a lot of the tracks on this record, they sort of like, they basically make one, like they have an outro. A lot of tracks on this record have an outro. I found myself thinking about Chorustus, which was also jams that were cut down, right? And yet Chorustus had this quality where it felt like that. It felt like a jam that was cut down. That might be because they cut it way more down, where they would be like 2-3 minutes long. But when you listen to Chorustus, each track sounds like it starts, in media res, you know what I mean? Like it was already going before we heard it. And then it usually makes like one move from like A to B. And then we ride that out and the track ends, and you feel like it would have continued going if we were privy to that, This feels more like, I never have that impression like it was going before the track started. I feel like it always has like a solid beginning. And then I feel like instead of making an A to B move, the tracks that do transform, they instead like make one shift into more of like a conclusion or an outro. You kind of get what I'm saying? It doesn't feel like a jam. It feels more like every track feels like a prepared, this is the main track, and then we sort of draw it to a conclusion kind of a thing.
I was thinking about that when listening, and like it definitely doesn't feel the same way as Chorustus, but I was thinking like, is it sometimes like just maybe even skillful editing here? I feel like
could be
some of these tracks, like they do kind of have like a jammy quality, and then it'll make that shift, and sometimes that shift like feels like it's maybe even just a whole other track or something. And I was thinking like, is that like the jam of it? Like did they take 5 minutes of this one, stitch it with 5 minutes of this one, and and here we go, that now we've got one track, or even did it go from that A to B and we just sort of cut out the middle man a little bit and got us there through editing? I'm never really sure, but I was thinking about that a lot, trying to see the seams. I think.
Yeah, interesting thought. I mean, I kind of feel like just for me, it feels more like the tracks are really fully defined, except for like a couple instances. Actually, we'll get to it, but the track Cloudline has like a weird slow start. Like it takes a while to get going. But most of the tracks, they like start in full form.
Out of the gate, yeah.
And then it feels like it sort of, falls apart or something at the end. And if the jam did continue, you imagine they kind of like, it took them a couple minutes to like pick up the pieces and get it going. But I do kind of feel like they were thinking in terms of this will be a track. That's like just, I feel like Choruses wasn't at all planned that way, and then they chopped it up into tracks. This feels like it's conceived of as tracks, but of course we'll never know. We'll keep moving. Track 11, which is called No Desh. Listener Rob said, still dark, hauntingly uneasy, staccato drums and unsettling synths, very dark and wintry.
Sunil says, it's a slow burn and the result is magical. A really interesting combination of bright synths, playful drums, and gloomy melody.
Joe says, this is the track that's grown on me the most over the years because I used to think it went on for too long and didn't develop enough to need 9 minutes, but now I understand it's totally great. This is the kind of thing you probably couldn't fit onto an album that's less than 2 hours, and one of the reasons why Exai works at the length that it is.
EBCD says, still a perplexing track to me after all these years. I think I can say that I enjoy it, especially for its jittering drums and genuinely haunting yet gorgeous outro. That being said, what confuses me about this track is that no matter how good I feel my sense of rhythm is getting, regardless of what time signature a song is in or whatever, I cannot figure out what is going on with this track. Like I couldn't tell you what time signature I think it's supposed to be in or anything. I could just be missing something really obvious, but the way this track is structured gives it such a prominently staggered and erratic beat that makes it really hard to follow, for better or for worse.
Yeah, funny because everything you just said, ABCD, is like why I love this track so much. I think it's one of my favorites on the record.
Same.
It is that like staggered and erratic beat. This feels like a kind of a test run for another one of my all-time favorite Autechre tracks, which is called, I think, SPTH on LSEC 5, I want to say. It's like, because the beat is so like kind of off balance or something, there's like extra empty space between kind of the clacking. And I actually really love because like the snare is like it's like a genuine like thunder crack, it is like such a slamming sound. And with all that empty space, what they do is like these kind of lush synth splashes. You really get to hear them echo out. It just feels like such like huge cavernous atmosphere in this track. I just think is like absolutely phenomenal. And what allows for that empty space is that start stop kind of pattern. I also especially love like the there's like this sputtering kind of hi-hat that is like almost obnoxiously loud, but again it like adds to the sense of like when it's empty, it really feels empty. And then this is another one of those tracks that has like those kind of Blade Lores-esque like sweeping kind of violins on it, very discordant, very like Schoenberg or something. Actually, it just occurred to me that like that kind of thunder crack of the snare, it reminds me a little bit of Pen Expers from Confield, but what do you think of this one?
On the percussion, I think it reminds me a lot. You remember that Aphex EP? It's called like Computer Controlled Instruments or something, where he's using like a real drum set with like some sort of computer controlled thing that's hitting it, and like it feels like a little bit like you have that little bit of empty space in between like the notes. It's like you're waiting for that piston or whatever to come out, and I know that was like an EP people didn't really enjoy all that much, but I really do like it for that reason. And I get like that same kind of feel here. But the synth, especially at the beginning, this sounds like Super Mario World a little bit. Like, do you get that a little bit? It's got like kind of I don't know, it's like sort of happy and stuff, but then, it does take that a bit of a turn and get spooky. So maybe it's more of a Luigi's Mansion sort of thing. But I don't know. Like it really like kind of gives me video game feels. But then at the end, like when that percussion goes away, it leaves like that huge reverb drone going. There's like some little plinking synth notes that come in, and that remind me of Virgin's Tim Hecker, that we did a couple, a month or so ago. And this is another one. I could let that end part, I could just ride that. You could ride that for an hour, like all in. That it's just so cool. I had marked as one of my favorites on the record as well.
Interesting. So despite reminding you of Luigi's Mansion, it's still
no. I mean that in the best way possible. Yeah. Those are great games. Yeah, it's one I think it really like came to I came to like it a lot more, because the first couple of times I was like, oh yeah, it's the Mario song, I remember that. But like as like you pay attention to the other stuff, like it really, for having such a Mario synth on it, it really does get spooky, like at towards the end and everything. And I think that's such a cool shift,
Yeah. All right, we'll move into track 12, which is called Run Repick. I feel like I never said this one out loud before, although I guess I did because we did an episode on it. Listener Sunil said, another stunning piece with fun, playful elements mixed in.
Rob says, dark, fairly propulsive, really moody, again, rapid-fire drums and slightly panicked synths give a sense of unease.
Listener Joe says, another one that feels like a beta version of the places they'd go on NTS3 and maybe some of LSEC. It sounds totally sick, but I don't think they nail the concept quite as well as they would later on, and this is one of the few moments where I feel like things get a bit stuck for a short time. Yeah, this is kind of an interesting one. It's another one of those, like, we're in the deep, and it's not one that I think I would ever, like, deliberately go to, but it is a little bit unique because we have so many, big slamming beats on this record. This is one of the more low-key, like kind of a puttering, more of like an electro type of a beat. It's got like a ping pong ball kind of a quality to it. More of these big, like kind of discordant string sweeps, which I really like as like a theme for this little stretch of tracks. And a cool, like kind of continuous, like deep bass, like it really fills the room, this one. Meanwhile, there are these kind of bendy blips like over the top. It almost sounds like there's a stand-up bass, like soloing over the top or something. Kind of a weird one. There's some laser zaps in there as well. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I think this one is pretty like sci-fi sounding. I like the drum sound. There's like almost no space in them, like they fully exist like digitally, which I think is pretty cool. It sounds like kind of, like an intense scene in a sci-fi movie, like I
right.
feel a little Vangelis Blade Runner DNA, in here, which I absolutely love. At the end, like that glitchy synth shit does that like octave jump, tone shift thing, which is always cool. And yeah, of course, like we just get into a real laser gun battle at the end, which is always fun.
Yeah, it is pretty sci-fi track, honestly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Well, we move into track 13, which is called SPL9. This I found very interesting, all right? The SPL prefix is shared with SPL47, which is from that JNSN code GL16 single. Sean confirmed there are a few other SPLs, but, quote, not 50. Okay, so I guess SPL 47, there isn't like a 9 through 47. But interesting to know, there's some other SPLs. Listener Rob wrote in to say, pots and pans at its finest before the kick-ass synths kick in around a minute and a half. This is like a scuzzy AE version of a techno dance track. It's nuts, but really good.
Joe says this sounds like a second half of Choristus track that's fighting tooth and nail against getting assimilated by the Borg, but at the end of the day, resistance is futile.
And Sunil says, to be honest, this one isn't my cup of tea. It just kind of gives me a headache. I think of this one as like Return of the Flip, Return of the Vec OS. It is certainly of that piece, and it's nice that, again, it's like another through line of the whole record because we're back to that really chaotic version. I guess this is probably the most chaotic of all. It's got like a, huge bass slam, real like car door snare, kind of like really clacking away, something like a robot buzzing kind of in the middle. And then it kind of goes up a notch into knock your head off mode, right? Where it just gets absolutely chaotic, like the most gnarled buzzy bass, really like there's like beeps just chaotically like mixed into the whole scrambled mess. And then it just keeps getting like more and more shredded. Like it turns into just this shredded synth wall by the end. It's one of those examples again of like, I forget which track I said this about, but the things you can do with Maximus P, where this thing feels like it's oozing and evolving the whole time, and just ends up in like destroyed noise territory. I guess I would say that, of the VecOS FLEP SPL9 group, this is probably easily my favorite of those chaotic ones.
Yeah, I think I might agree. I like this one. It's definitely like incredibly frantic, and it just like really pounds you. Rob said it. This is pots and pans core, in the best way possible. I think the main synth line kind of sounds a little video gamey again, but in a cool way. It reminded me, like the whole they almost did Metroid or whatever. Everybody knows that.
That's
but
right.
It sort of made me think of that. I was listening to this.
That's interesting. So we would say like maybe the identity of this EP is like, this is the video game EP, because we've said that about No Dash. Run Repick is like kind of a sci-fi thing, and now this one.
Yeah. Because I think the sci-fi thing, works with video games. Yeah, definitely. And this is the end of this 12-inch or this side at least. I was listening to this one like on the stereo, and my wife came by to get a drink or something, and she was like, I'm gonna have to listen to the episode because I don't know what the hell you say about this. She's like, it doesn't just beeping and booping and what, just chaos. So this one, pots and pans all the way.
That's right. Yeah, it's funny. My wife came in the room when I was listening to Blade Low Res, and she was like grooving. She was like, "This is good stuff."
Nice.
So.
It's just gonna get pilled.
Yeah, eventually. All right, so we move into the final EP here, the final cluster of tracks with track 14 called Cloudline. Listener Sunil said, "This is the most perplexing track on Exai. I feel like I don't quite get it, but I still enjoy it. A cousin of Jada VC, perhaps. It has a mechanical quality about it, like a wind-up device with springs and gears. Feels like it keeps stopping and starting."
EBCD says, "I might be a bit biased towards Cloudline, since I remember Sean saying it was his favorite track on the album at some point, but regardless, I do really enjoy this one, and I think it's definitely my favorite of the 10-plus minute tracks. I think the intro with all its shrieking and wailing synths is totally iconic, and the relaxed hip-hop groove that makes its way in is just really solid and refreshing to hear come from such an aggressive and chaotic album. I especially love the booming 808 kick that occasionally comes in to accent certain bars. This track also has some more great melodies structured in a way that makes them really memorable and catchy despite the lack of repetition. The initial call and response of the descending bass line followed by the sort of vocal-sounding synth is a lot of fun in particular."
Listener Joe says, "This is the kind of track that only Autechre could even possibly dream of making. I don't even know how to begin to describe this."
Rob says, "Those high-pitched tones are designed to make the listener feel uneasy, uncomfortable. After about 2.5 minutes, the fat bass and slower tempo take this into the realm of hip-hop. It's quite funky, elements of Kraftwerk even."
Yeah, so this is, I think, this is like our last, 10-minuter. I mean, Rexon almost gets there, but this feels like the last of the kind of anchor tracks. Interesting to learn that it is one of Sean's favorites, which I wasn't really aware of, but I find this one maybe like my least favorite of the big, 10-minuters. I find it a little strange. I kind of feel like I'm on the same page as Sunil, which is like, I don't know if I totally get it, but I do still enjoy it. It is the only track on the record that has like a slow start, like I was saying earlier. It like kind of takes a couple minutes to like find itself. The kick is really hesitant and tentative at the beginning. There's like some kind of squeaking highs in there. This like kind of clap comes in, but it's very light. And, eventually like the kick kind of takes on this cool, like lo-fi sort of static or like this little rattle to it. And then it starts going, and then, which listener was it? The EBCD, who sort of pointed out the like cool call and response quality of this, where you get this kind of like these like bouncy plucks sort of descend. There's like a delay on them, like doom, 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 doom. And then it's like answered by these little like doom, 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 like these little, groovy octave hooks, that's cool. Those kind of like those little synths, they get like maybe chunkier, more angular, more boxy as it goes on, but it stays pretty like steady, this track, for like the whole 10 minutes. It just doesn't, I don't know. I just have mixed feelings about this one, as like it takes a while to get off the ground, and then that's not even that high off the ground, even though I do kind of enjoy it. What do you think?
I think I agree with you and Sunil. I feel the same way. Of these big, the big long ones, this is my least favorite for basically the same reasons. Also, at the beginning, like in that screeching synth, which is cool, I like. But there's like some flange on that. And yeah. I don't know what it is, but flange is like the worst effect, and it just takes me out of anything. It's like it's the it's seeing the strings or something, like, but in a movie, it just like exactly what it is. It always sounds the same to me, and it just annoys me. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but these like rattling hi-hat hits. We get into the hip hop. I think we said at the beginning, like, this is sort of the hip hop 12-inch. I think that starts here. When another thing, like, this one has, and I think I read somewhere, like, Sean said that they had sampled like tape hiss on it, and here, like, especially in headphones, like, it feels like there's tape hiss on it, but it's like pitched up, like it's got like a glassier, higher pitched sound, but sounds like tape hissed, and so I really wonder if that's what it is there or what, but it kind of gets a little annoying in headphones. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I like at the end, actually, like, that kind of like squeaking, squealing, maybe that's what it is, like, tape hiss mixed in there, but it starts to get like really piercing and really sounds like the music for the Psycho movie, sort of like it has that kind of like shrieking like sound to it, even though it's like sort of sustained out. But yeah, I think it's just the fact that it takes so long to get going, I just find kind of odd. But we move into, for me, like another killer stretch of tracks with track 15, Deco Loc. AE Pages had this to say: the sample manipulations are achieved via a video cut-up patch made around 2005 to 2006 by Rob, where Sean then took the patch and did some hip-hop type stuff with it. That was a quote. Sean noted the percussion he added was just samples of wood and rubber. One of the samples for Deco Loc was found to be from a Bowls Liqueurs ad, which was uncovered via one of the Autechre's streams. The other sample is still unknown. Finally, Deco may refer to the assembly command of the same name for decimal output. Here's what our listeners had to say. Rob says, the sampled voices here are always a bit of a shock. There's something UK garage about the beats in this one. The samples take me back to London of the early aughts. The reverb and tone make me think of snatches of Underworld or even Disclosure. Takes me back to a specific time and place.
Joe says another one that captures the essence of Exai and couldn't fit on literally any other Autechre album.
Listener Avery says, my real issue with this album is everything from 1-1 Is to Rex On. Sitting through those 7 tracks in a row needs to be a Guinness World Record. Imagine everything I've already said about Veko S and Flep, but stretched out over 51 minutes. What baffles me is AE has never really had issues sequencing their albums like this before. The only glimpse of light in that hellhole of a track list is Run Rupick and Deco Loc, though Deco Loc is just for the novelty of hearing them make a track that uses vocal samples.
Sunil says, simply fun.
I love it. I love going from Avery to Sunil, like, fun.
Yeah, I know.
This one, I think it's like, it's got kind of a novelty effect because the voices are so surprising. I think it has something of like a similar function as, Jada VC. Remember, like, it is kind of a shock to the system to hear such a like lush, synth and something so pretty all of a sudden after like what had been 15 minutes of like really grimy dubby kind of stuff. I feel like they decided, all right, for this final stretch we need another shock to the system. I think that was very smart, you know what I mean, because it's like, we are in the thick of it, as Avery said, it didn't work for them, but I kind of like that shock to the system of like this slamming kick, this kind of zap of a snare, and then this like stuttering male voice, There's a lot of like, I don't know, noisy, like kind of dial up sounds over the top, but it too is stuttering. There is then a chopped kind of, sounds like a male singing or like maybe pitched down or something. It's kind of scary, to be honest. And then this kind of more like angelic human voice that gets chopped up. It, really gets chopped into like very, like micro fragments in a way that reminds me, and maybe it's just because we're getting ready to do this episode, but like of The Field, the way, like the very micro way that he'll use vocal samples, or of course Burial, right? I definitely hear the woodblock in here, like 100%. I do. But I like it it has that novelty effect, but you kind of agree with me. Like you needed something really surprising to happen to get us through the final stretch here.
Yeah, again, this is another sort of White Album one. It's not one I think I would put on its own. I probably wouldn't add it to a playlist or something. But yeah, you need something here, to be a little different. It's definitely interesting, like, the vocal samples coming out of nowhere and everything. On its own, I think it's like maybe one of the lower, tier tracks in my opinion. But again, I think in its placement and stuff, it works.
All right, we'll keep it moving. I know, it's a long episode, but I think part of the fun of doing this revisited series is like, the first time we did these albums, we kind of talked like more holistically. So now we get this opportunity to kind of do it a little differently by going track by track. And there's some of these tracks that I guess we probably didn't even like talk that much about. So it's kind of fun to give them their due. So we're on to Rexon. AE Pages had this to say: Rexon uses drum samples from a factory disc. They give the examples, but I don't even know what that means. For the EMU SP12, they also say the track uses compression and layered tape hiss, with most of it being envelopes. Our listeners had these things to say. Rob says huge beats with hi-hats over the top, huge bass. It's funky, propulsive, and heavy. This one might be worth checking out on my speakers.
Joe says, reminds me of Netlon Sentinel in a really good way. A perfect penultimate track that serves as a coda to what comes before and a bridge to the final act.
Listener Sunil just says, banger. So, Rexon, I got to say, this is another one that's like a contender for one of my favorite tracks on the whole record. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, we're full hip hop here. I like that. Like the beat is just so great. Like the kick snare, like kick snare.
It's basically like the Straight Outta Compton beat. You know what I mean? It's a little slower, but it's like straight out of Compton.
Yeah. It is. I love it. It's such a good beat. To like that chewed up synth. Sometimes it's like so fuzzy that it's like its sound is like you're just hearing like the tiniest bit of it is actually making it through to your speakers. That's such a cool thing. This is a great track.
Yeah, I think this has like the best bass on the whole record. Like it is so fat, like so full. I just like love listening to this one. And I think it was Rob said, I think I got to play this one on my speakers. Like, yeah, this one really bangs on speakers. Absolute banging hip hop. It almost makes you wonder, like, it has the quality of like, is it sampling a snare? You know what I mean? Like it sounds like a real snare in a way. And, and it's kind of cool, right? But it has this almost like 808-esque, it doesn't sound like an 808, but it's like the way that the bass is kind of pulsing has that kind of big full 808 quality. There's like lots of electricity kind of buzzing, in, some wubby low end again, like added to the thing. And then I forget which listener who mentioned the hat, but like the hat is great. The hi-hat is crazy. Like it's honestly just so loud. It's like funny because it'll sort of disappear. It's got this sort of start-stop thing going on. It'll disappear. And then when it joins back in, it honestly just makes me laugh every time because it is like so loud, the hi-hat.
Yeah. It's crazy.
All right. So we move into the final track, YJYUX. I'm like you. I can never remember like what the order of the letter is. AE Pages said that Rob used a Sunvox for this. And then our listeners Joe said, maybe the best closer to any Autechre album in a career full of incredible closers. It isn't too overly emotional, but it gives a satisfying conclusion to the moves that we've just heard.
Rob says synth noodling to begin with, and then warbling synths and beats join in. I like the speed at which this track slowly unfolds. Absolutely no rush. Scuzzy, muffled foghorn-like tones buzz through my headphones, whilst higher-pitched tones and snatches of background melodies give a faint burial vibe. Again, this is very atmospheric, with synths given plenty of reverb, and the melodies are playing deeper in the mix, giving an overall depth. This is a down-tempo final track, which is a bold move, but I would liken it to the end of a zombie/horror movie where you're just grateful to have survived to the end.
Listener Sunil says, another all-time favorite. I've run out of words to describe these tracks, but this one's a masterpiece.
Avery says, thankfully, this album ends on a better note. It's a funny little ambient track that ties up the album well.
Yeah, so this closer, I mean, I think of this as like the most oversteps of the tracks on Exai, as I think you sort of agree with me, right? I'll be interested to revisit this eventually, but like Oversteps is one of my least favorite Autechre records, like I mentioned before. But I find that this sort of touch at the end of Overstep's style is nice. You know, it sort of works in this limited way, and it has something of like a meta effect to this whole record, where if this is the sound of them like kind of, you know, trying to get control of a new system and like this kind of rough early go at it, this one has the most like Oversteps like control and perfection. You know, it is almost like it's very melodic, lots of layers of like sort of cascading arpeggios and just like really gorgeous. There are like these kind of electro stabs that join that add another layer of melody. And so it almost sounds like, I don't know, this is overreading it for sure, but it's like this record ends with them mastering the system, you know, and now they can make Oversteps again, you know, now they can make pretty music again after they kind of hashed it out through all that dirty, grimy, murky shit through this whole record. I kind of like it ending, you know, because otherwise, if you know what I mean, it would feel like quite out of place on this record, but it works at the end, you know?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that's a great read on it. It is like, I think if it stayed just like grimy the whole time, you know, it's like they never get a grasp on it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would work as well over 2 hours, you know, like to just kind of end up in the same place you were. I think that is like really a great move to like, now, you know, we're kind of like the opposite end of the spectrum here, you know?
Yeah, and it's not like a fully, you know, just pretty, you know, it's not like a sign track or something, because it does have like this floppy kick, you know, in it, and then like the snare sounds broken, you know, it's kind of like it actually has a hole in it or something, and kind of adds like this cool, you know, again, like, you know, so it feels tied, you know, to the rest of the record, but it does feel like this kind of release at the end, very emotive, very emotional, you know, lovely conclusion. So now that we've reached the end of this, you know, mammoth record, any change in your overall impressions? Any new clarity in its relationship to like the stuff that came after, especially 2022 Dash, or just overall thoughts?
I mean, I think definitely, like I said, this has always been like one of my favorites. So, you know, I kind of knew, I knew it well, like as a whole, I think. But it was like really illuminating and interesting and fun to like break it down piece by piece. Because again, you know, like the White Album thing, like generally it doesn't like hold up to that scrutiny. So it was really fun doing that, and I enjoyed it. I think, you know, you easily can see like the seeds being planted for AE 2022 Dash. I mean, there's like some percussion moments and things that reminded me of what I remember of, you know, set E, you know, like some of the like real frantic things. I was like, oh, I that's kind of what it felt like in that room that night and stuff, you know? So I definitely could see, you know, those seeds being planted there. I mean, this is just like, you know, the turn to a new form of Autechre, and, you know, like the one I hold to such a high esteem, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's like a return to form. I just have a new appreciation, like I said at the top, for like, this record is very imperfect, and that's what's so special about it. I mean, I think they went real deep into like endless tinkering, and then obviously, you know, to a degree, like even untilted, and then chorus disc was like a way to kind of, try to shift away, like, get back to using hardware or like to jamming and stuff. But this is like that kind of eureka moment where it sounds really loose and rough and like they're not in total control, and it's really like refreshing and fun. Just like, Sean said in this most recent interview, they're like, that's how they used to make music a little bit. There's stuff that ends up on record that was like an accident, and there's a lot of accidents all over this record. I think that's what makes it really special. To kind of wrap up with a few final thoughts from listeners, big picture stuff. Listener Joe said on Reddit a few days back, and I noticed this, there was a discussion about whether or not Exai would have worked better as a single CD 70-ish minute album, and what tracks should be kept or cut. There might have been a time earlier in my life that I would have been sympathetic to this argument, but now I think the idea of cutting down Exai is just totally missing the point. A huge part of what makes Exai so epic and majestic is its size. The music and sound design itself is just absolutely huge, and the relatively long runtime really adds to its punch in my view. I guess you're not going to be on board with like cutting this thing down, but do you think there's a way, everybody likes to, just for fun, like play with the White Album, for example, like what would a single disc White Album look like? Like, do you think you could make like a classic 70-minute record from this?
I hate these kind of things, because I don't think, I know no one's actually doing it, but I don't like the idea of like cutting things of someone's work or whatnot. And in fact, I saw this thread and I think I replied something like, I wouldn't cut shit out of it. Cause I think like what is so great about it is like the length and stuff, like, sure, could you make like a more digestible 70-minute thing? Like, yeah, of course. But I think you're just going to lose like so much of like what makes this special, that I'm completely unwilling to do it.
I agree. I think it is like, it is the size. It is the weird like odds and ends, like the little nooks and crannies and weird corners that they get into, the way they get to stretch out, even on something like Cloudline that I think is like the one moment I think is a little too stretched out, right? Or it's like a little too, takes a while to like get to its thing.
But that's what I want.
Yeah. But I like having that stuff and like seeing a little bit of that. I mean, I think that there are times like on LSEC, which is obviously, we'll get to that one, I'm sure. But like, in fact, I think it would be really fun to like do the LSECs, disc at a time, which is like really good to do and see if they stand
I was
up.
going to tell you that. Yeah.
But like, there are times on the LSECs where they really, they should have cut it more. You know what I mean? It like almost like stretches out too much. This is like that perfect happy medium, I think. Anything you don't like, I mean, it's not gonna be around too long, This is another one from EBCD. It's a long one, but I think it's pretty cool. So I want to read it in full. They write, I was thinking more about how Exai connects to Autechre's overall relationship with physical versus digital media. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how fucked up it's actually been across their career. And here's this like epic list, okay? Flutter is designed to be played at 33 and a third RPM and 45 RPM, implying that vinyl is the definitive format for Anti. Tri-Repite is complete with surface noise, as we all know, implying that vinyl is the definitive format for the album, except the Tri-Repite Plus release in the US comes with the bonus disc of Anvil Vapor and Garbage, as if to suggest the CD is more complete in terms of the content it offers. That's a very good point. I literally forgot about the Tri-Repite Plus release. We Are RY was only officially released on vinyl. Anvil Vapor, Envain, Sickly Sweet, and EP7 all got vinyl releases, but for whatever reason, the track listings were split across multiple records that were not sold together, making CD and digital a lot more convenient and enticing. LP5's vinyl packaging is so blunt and bare bones, it almost seems like a joke to get people more enticed in the CD version, on top of CD and digital having an exclusive hidden track. Gantz Graph is available on vinyl, but the CD comes with a DVD including the music video. Sean stated about Chorus Disc that, quote, the actual product is the FLAC file, but Versions was exclusively released on CD at the time, and now both are reissued on vinyl, except Quadrange is still digital exclusive. Oversteps got a special edition vinyl with fancy box set packaging and a poster. Exai is explicitly stated to be engaged with as if it's a series of 12 inches. LSEC is exclusively available digitally, and Sean explicitly stated in a Twitch AMA that it was his and Rob's own decision to not release it physically because they thought no one would want to own it physically or something like that, but also the track listing is conveniently split as if it's a series of 5 discs. NTS Sessions debuted on radio and has a digital exclusive bonus track, but also the physical editions have exclusive edits of the tracks. Across their whole discography, most bonus tracks are available exclusively on CD, except for Sinistrale Sentinel. I don't really know what conclusion to draw from this, other than that either Rob and Sean can't agree on their preferred medium, their opinions are constantly shifting, or it varies depending on the release. Love this rundown. I mean, this is so good, but because it's true that they do seem to like, each release has its individual medium that they kind of try to steer you toward. Like I said at the top, though, I think what's special about Exai is that it genuinely works like from a couple different angles, I think. I don't think that's true for almost any of these other ones, you know, but what do you think of all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like an interesting thing that they play around with. And I wonder how much of it is just like, you know, wanting to play with the mediums, what is like just the time period they're working, you know, the era they work in is like such a shifting, you know, media format, you know, like we in not that many years, we go from like Exai, you know, coming on CD and stuff to LSEC not even needing a CD, you know, like only being digital, you know, like I wonder how much of it is like dictated by the times and what is artistically chosen, and even things like Try Repete plus, like, is that their idea, or is that just like a kind of a way for back in the day, like to sell those EPs like to America like a little easier and stuff? But that is interesting because I think like that's like the first Autechre thing I have, and I had, and like I don't think I knew until much later on that like there's EPs tacked on that. I just thought Try Repete was long as shit. I think I'm similar.
Yeah, I think I didn't realize that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I did until I like dug into them, you know?
Yeah, I think it's just like, I don't know. It really like reading EBCD's like kind of rundown here. It makes me feel strongly that they must sit down and have a conversation at some point. Like, what is the medium for this one? You know, like what is like the prime way? Like it actually seems to be an important decision that they make somewhere along the process. Like maybe they even start working on it and they're like, you know what, this feels more like vinyl, you know? And then somehow that kind of like locks something in for them. I mean, they obviously must have a conversation about like, okay, well, this is going to play with the format because blah, blah, blah. But like for Exai, they have literally said, at some point in the process, they sat down and were like, let's make 4 EPs that kind of go in a box, you know? I don't know if they're being totally honest about that, but yeah, seeing it all laid out, I'm like, damn, they really do every single time have that conversation somewhere, right?
Yeah, but I mean, even with Exai here, you know, if the vinyl is like the preferred, that's only been released once, like only in England.
That's right.
It's like hard to find, you know, it's like not readily, you know, if that's the medium, it's not readily available in that medium, which is another odd choice. But also, you know, is that just economics? A box set like that, especially today, is not cheap to produce or purchase, you know?
Well, what do you guys think? We've made it to the end of this juggernaut. We were worried it was going to be like a 4-hour podcast, but we made it. We ready to wrap up with some quick new music recommendations?
Yeah. All right, for this week, there's a brand new box out about one of my favorite and I think most interesting periods of the Beach Boys. The box set's called We Gotta Groove, focuses on 76, 77, around Brian's big return and the album The Beach Boys Love You. And if you've never listened to that record, now's your chance. Starts out the box set. Brian's got a Moog, so Autechre adjacent. We've got synths being brought in, and just like the most insane ideas for songs. There's songs about Johnny Carson, the solar system, airplanes, honking down the gosh darn highway. It's absolutely insane. The box set's the whole Love You record, bunch of outtakes from that, and 15 big ones, the preceding record, and also like the second biggest bootleg after Smile called Adult Child, which is just genuinely nuts. I can't recommend it enough. I seriously, if you put on Love You, if you've never heard it before, I guarantee you'll say what the fuck within like 10 to 15 seconds. It's
okay.
It's so
I can
great.
confirm because I had never listened to this, and I put on this set when it came out, and I thought, what the fuck? And actually, I was listening with my wife, and she was like, first off, she was like, this is the Beach Boys? Like, it doesn't sound so like,
yeah,
pretty and angelic. And I was like, yeah, this was after he took a little time away from the band. He was going through some stuff. And she was like, well, he sounds pretty goddamn rough. And it does have that
a lot of cigarettes.
Yeah. It has a pretty weird, I'm going to keep listening because I am like intrigued, but it threw me for a bit of a loop. Yeah.
I Love You is... But Brian said it's the direct sequel to Pet Sounds, and
Okay.
I agree with him. It's I love it so much, ironically and unironically. It's so great.
Wow. Well, I've got another reissue to recommend this week, which this came out maybe, I don't know, a week or two ago, but Sacred Bones has reissued the first 2 solo Alan Vega records, and I had not listened to them, but I'm especially enjoying the first one. It's just self-titled Alan Vega. I'm just like loving the shit out of this record, and it's so funny because I started listening to it and it sort of occurred to me, I was like, wait a minute, we just talked about Pansonic. I was like, Pansonic is Suicide for electronic music. I mean, that's really what it is. And I put on the Suicide record, and I was like, God, it sounds so Pansonic. And then I realized that I already knew this, but I forgot that after Coma, Pansonic did a record with Alan Vega. So I'm not even that smart. They had the idea before me.
I have a EP right here. It's Sun, Pansonic, and Alan Vega. On the EP, they do Che from Suicide all together. It's great.
It's just crazy, though. You know what I mean? Like what Suicide was doing with punk adjacent music. Pansonic, it's exactly what they were doing with, techno dance music later on. Anyway, this record, self-titled Alan Vega record, is not so out there as Suicide, but it still has that, kind of minimalist, delays and reverb kind of a thing, but it just bangs.
Yeah, it's good. I like that record. Well, that's it for this time. Next time, we got a bonus episode on The Field's Cupid's Head. Join us by heading over to patreon.com/GONKCAST. After that, a main episode free for everybody on Autechre's L Event EP. Share your thoughts via Patreon, or you can email us gonkcastpod@gmail.com. If you like the show, help us out. Tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Follow us on social media. All that's at GONKCastPod. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.